The night London's most powerful man walked into the Ashford ballroom, every conversation died. Not slowly, not politely, died, like a candle crushed between two fingers. Duke Cedric Ravenshire stood 6'3" in black from collar to boot, and the scar running from his left temple to his jaw told a story no one dared ask about twice. He was 38. He had buried his father, his brother, and most of his capacity for mercy somewhere between the two. And tonight, he had come to collect a bride he had never met. Stay with me. What happens next will cost him everything he swore he would never give. The carriage rattled through the wet London streets at 9:30, and Cedric sat inside it the way a man sits inside his own coffin, still, resigned, and furious about the entire arrangement. Rain streaked the windows in crooked lines. The gas lamps outside threw jaundiced light across his face, catching the hollows under his cheekbones and the hard set of his mouth. He had not slept in 2 days. He had not wanted to. Across from him sat Mr. Geoffrey Hale, his solicitor of 11 years, a man shaped like a bread loaf who had long since learned that silence was the only currency the Duke respected. Hale held a leather folder on his lap, and inside it were the marriage contracts, the property transfers, the medical certification of Lady Evelyn Whitmore's fitness to bear children. Everything reduced to ink and clauses. Everything except the dying woman's voice still echoing in Cedric's skull. Promise me. His mother, 61 years old, spine eaten through by disease, hands like paper, eyes still sharp enough to cut glass. Promise me you won't let this name die in the dark, Cedric. He had promised. Not because he believed in legacy or bloodlines or any of the horseshit the aristocracy fed itself to justify its existence. He had promised because she was the only human being left on this earth whose opinion he could not, 28, discard. And now she was dying in the east wing of Ravenshire Manor, and he was in a rattling box heading toward a woman whose name he had learned 6 weeks ago. The Whitmore family will be present at the church tomorrow, Hale said carefully, testing the silence the way a man tests thin ice with his boot. Her uncle, Lord Bertram Whitmore. Her aunt. 2 cousins. I didn't ask. You should know that Lord Whitmore has been vocal about the terms. Cedric turned his head. Just his head. The rest of his body stayed perfectly still, and that stillness was the thing that made powerful men stammer in his presence. Vocal how? Hale swallowed. He believes the settlement is insufficient. He's been telling people at White's that you're purchasing his niece like livestock, and that the least you could do is compensate the family who raised her. Something moved behind Cedric's eyes. Not anger. Anger was too simple, too clean for what lived inside this man. It was something closer to recognition. The recognition of a predator identifying another predator's tactics. The family who raised her, Cedric repeated. The family who kept her as an unpaid governess for their own children. The family who denied her a season, denied her a dowry, and paraded her at exactly one social event in 9 years, the Marchioness of Thornton's charity luncheon, where she was seated behind a pillar. Hale blinked. You've done research. I've done enough. Cedric looked back at the rain. Whitmore can take the settlement as offered, or he can take nothing and explain to his creditors why he fumbled £40,000, because his pride got caught in his throat. Either way, I will be at St. George's at 11 o'clock tomorrow, and there will be a bride at the altar. The rest is decoration. The carriage hit a rut. Hale clutched his folder. The conversation was over. What Cedric did not say, what he would never say to a solicitor or a servant or any living soul, was that he had seen Lady Evelyn Whitmore exactly once before agreeing to the match. It had been at the Hartfield auction house 3 months ago. He had gone to acquire a set of naval maps from the Peninsular War. She had been standing in the back of the gallery, alone, examining a small oil painting of a shipwreck with the kind of quiet attention that most people reserved for prayer. She was not beautiful, not in the way London defined beauty. Not porcelain and gold and engineered curves designed to trigger a man's wallet. She was thin, pale in a way that suggested insufficient meals rather than fashionable delicacy. Her dress was at least 4 seasons old, the hem restitched twice, and her hair was pinned in a style so plain it bordered on defiance. But her hands. He had noticed her hands, the way they hovered just above the painting's frame, fingers tracing the brushstrokes without touching them, as though she understood that some things could only be appreciated across a distance. He had watched her for 11 minutes. He had counted. Then he had gone home and told his mother he had found a candidate. The old Duchess had asked only one question. Is she kind? Cedric had not answered because he did not know what kindness looked like anymore. But he had said, she is not cruel. And his mother had closed her eyes and whispered, then she is already better than we deserve. The carriage stopped. They had arrived at the Mayfair townhouse Cedric kept for London business. Hale gathered his things and stepped out first, holding an umbrella that the wind immediately tried to murder. Cedric followed without bothering to shield himself from the rain. Water hit his shoulders, his face, ran down the scar tissue on his jaw. He did not flinch. He had stopped flinching at 22, the year his father beat him for the last time. Inside, the house was lit but lifeless. 14 rooms, 6 servants, no portraits on the walls. Cedric had removed them all years ago. Every painting of every Ravenshire ancestor staring down from their gilded frames like a jury of the dead. He could not stand their eyes. He could not stand the implication that he owed them something simply because they had existed first. His valet, Morris, met him in the foyer with a glass of whiskey and the evening's correspondence. Morris was 54, former military, missing the last 2 fingers on his left hand from a cannon misfire at Badajoz. He was the closest thing Cedric had to a friend, though neither of them would have used that word. Letter from your cousin, Morris said. Mr. Edmund Ravenshire. Cedric took the glass, but not the letter. Burn it. It's the 3rd one this month. Then it should burn faster. Morris set the letter on the hall table without expression. He had served Cedric for 16 years and understood the architecture of the Duke's hatred, the way a cartographer understands a coastline. Every inlet, every submerged reef, every place where the water turned black and the current pulled down. Edmund Ravenshire, 29, handsome in the way that made mothers push their daughters forward and fathers lock up their silver. Son of Cedric's late uncle, the second son who had spent his life resenting the first. Edmund had grown up in that resentment like a vine grows in poisoned soil, twisted, ambitious, and utterly convinced that the dukedom should have been his father's, and therefore should one day be his. He had been circling for years, politely, strategically, attending every family function, writing solicitous letters to the dying Duchess, positioning himself as the concerned kinsman worried about the succession. And now that Cedric was marrying, now that there was a chance, however slim, of an heir, Edmund's letters had tripled in frequency and quadrupled in false warmth. Cedric drank his whiskey standing up. He did not sit down in rooms where he was alone. Sitting meant settling. Settling meant staying. And staying meant thinking. And thinking led to places he had walled off so long ago the mortar had turned to stone. The church is confirmed for 11, Morris said. Flowers have been delivered. The Whitmore party will arrive at 10:30. And Lady Evelyn? A pause. Morris measured his words the way a surgeon measures an incision. She will be dressed and ready, Your Grace. Her aunt's lady's maid has been assigned to attend her. Her aunt's maid. Lady Whitmore did not see fit to hire anyone specifically for the occasion. Cedric set the glass down. The sound it made against the marble table was small and precise, like a period at the end of a death sentence. Send Mrs. Crawford to the Whitmore residence at 7 tomorrow morning. Full trousseau. Whatever Lady Evelyn needs, charge it to my account. Lady Whitmore may object to... Lady Whitmore may do whatever she pleases with her objections. I did not ask for her comfort. I asked for Mrs. Crawford at 7. Morris nodded and disappeared into the house. Cedric stood alone in the foyer, whiskey burning a line down his chest, and stared at the wall where portraits used to hang. The plaster was a shade lighter where the frames had blocked the sun. Ghost rectangles. A gallery of absence. I thought about tomorrow. He thought about standing in a church beside a woman he did not know, speaking vows he did not believe in, performing a ritual designed by centuries of men who needed to own things in order to feel alive. He thought about his mother's face when he told her it was done, and whether she would live long enough to see it. He did not think about love. Love was a word for people who still had enough left inside them to burn. The morning came gray and heavy, the sky over London pressing down like a lid on a pot. St. George's, Hanover Square, the church where aristocrats married their ambitions to each other, stood rain-darkened and severe against the cloud cover. Carriages lined the street. The ton had turned out in force, not out of affection for the bride or groom, but out of the same impulse that draws a crowd to a public hanging, the need to witness someone else's catastrophe. Inside, the pews were full of silk and judgment. Dowagers whispered behind fans. Young lords lounged with studied indifference. And the gossip. The gossip was a living thing, slithering between the rows like smoke. 38 and never once courted a woman publicly. You know what they say about men like that. And the bride. Who is she? Some distant Whitmore relation? I heard she was practically a servant in their household. Charity match, has to be. The Duchess is dying and the Duke needs an heir before the cousin swoops in. Poor creature. Imagine being sold to that man. Sold? Darling, she was given away. There is a difference. You sell things that have value. Laughter. Quiet, refined, lethal. At the front of the church, Cedric stood with his back to all of it. He wore black. Not the fashionable charcoal or midnight blue that other men chose to signal wealth without severity, but true black, the color of finality. His hands were clasped behind his back. His jaw was set. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad who had already forgiven the bullets. Hale stood to his right, sweating. The vicar stood at the altar, clutching his Bible like a shield. And then the doors opened. Eveline Whitmore walked in alone. No father to give her away. He had been dead since she was 12. No uncle. Lord Whitmore had refused to walk her down the aisle after a final screaming argument about the settlement that morning. No cousin, no friend, no ally. Just a woman in a white dress that did not quite fit. Mrs. Crawford had done her best in 12 hours, but miracles require more time than money. Walking the longest aisle in London without a single hand to hold. The whispers became a roar. Every head turned, every fan fluttered, and the cruelty of it hit the room like a wave, because there is nothing the tongue enjoys more than watching someone drown in public. Eveline walked steadily. Her eyes were fixed on the altar, not on the faces, not on the mouths moving behind gloved hands. Her chin was up. Not high, not proud, just level. The chin of a woman who had learned long ago that looking down meant falling and looking up meant hoping, and she could not afford either one. Cedric watched her come. He had expected many things. Tears, perhaps. Trembling. The panicked eyes of a trapped animal. He had prepared himself for fragility, because fragility was what the world had told him to expect from women, and despite all his intelligence, he was not yet wise enough to know how much of what the world told him was a lie. But Eveline did not tremble. She did not cry. She walked through the cruelty like a woman walking through rain, aware of it, soaked by it, but refusing to run. And something inside Cedric, something buried so deep he had forgotten its name, cracked. Not broke. Cracking and breaking are different things. Breaking is loud and final. Cracking is quiet. Cracking is the sound a wall makes when it realizes it cannot hold forever. She reached the altar. She looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were gray. Not the romantic silver gray of novels, but a real gray. The gray of winter mornings, of stone, of things that endure. And in them he saw something that he recognized with the shock of a man catching his own reflection in a window he thought was someone else's. She was not afraid of him. She was not afraid of anything in this room. She had passed through fear so many times it had become familiar territory, and she moved through it now with the economy of someone who knew the landscape by heart. The vicar began speaking. The words washed over Cedric like water over stone. He said what he was told to say. She said what she was told to say. Rings were exchanged. His was plain gold, hers slightly too large because no one had thought to measure her finger. She held it in place with her thumb during the final blessing, a small, practical gesture that no one noticed except the man who would spend the rest of his life noticing everything she did. They signed the register. They walked back down the aisle as husband and wife. The Ton watched them pass with the satisfied contempt of people who had just confirmed their lowest expectations. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained hostile. A carriage waited, the Ravenshire crest on the door, black horses stamping in the wet street. Cedric handed Eveline in first and followed, and the door closed, and for the first time they were alone. Silence. The kind of silence that has texture and weight. Eveline sat with her hands folded in her lap, the too large ring visible against her pale fingers. She looked out the window. Her profile was sharp, a narrow nose, a stubborn jaw, cheekbones that in another life, with another diet, might have been striking. She did not fill the carriage with nervous chatter. She did not ask where they were going. She simply existed in the space beside him with a self-containment that was so complete it was almost hostile. Cedric found himself, for the first time in years, uncertain of what to say. He was a man who used words the way other men used weapons, precisely, economically, and always to draw blood. But this woman had disarmed him simply by not requiring anything from him. Most people wanted something: approval, attention, fear. She sat beside him wanting nothing, and the absence of demand created a vacuum he did not know how to fill. "The ceremony was adequate," he said finally. She turned from the window, looked at him. "It was a ceremony. You walked alone." "I have always walked alone, Your Grace." Today was not remarkable in that respect. Her voice was low and even. No self-pity, no fishing for sympathy, just a flat statement of fact, delivered with the same emotional register one might use to describe the weather. And it hit him harder than any accusation or tearful confession could have, because the absence of performance meant the pain was real, and so deeply integrated into her existence that she no longer thought it worth mentioning. "Your uncle," Cedric said, "his refusal to escort you, that was deliberate humiliation. Lord Whitmore is a man who requires control. When he cannot control a situation, he sabotages it. This is not new information. It will not happen again." She studied him. There was something analytical in her gaze, something that measured and categorized and filed away. He was not used to being studied. He was used to being feared. "You speak with great certainty for a man who married a stranger 2 hours ago." "Certainty is not dependent on familiarity, Lady Ravenshire. It is dependent on authority. And in this marriage, authority is not ambiguous." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He counted, and then turned back to the window. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose it is not." The carriage rolled on. They did not speak again until they reached the townhouse where a wedding breakfast had been arranged that neither of them wanted. The breakfast was a performance, like everything else the Tun did. 50 guests in a room designed for 30, champagne flowing like a bribe, and enough forced smiles to power a small theater. Lord Whitmore had come after all, the lure of free food and social visibility proving stronger than his wounded pride. And he held court in a corner, telling anyone who would listen about the sacrifices his family had made in raising Evelyn. Took her in when she had nothing, not a penny from her father's estate, all gambled away before the man had the decency to die. My wife clothed her, fed her, educated her, alongside our own daughters. And this is the gratitude we receive. Spirited away by a duke who couldn't be bothered to court her properly. Cedric heard every word. He was positioned across the room, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, and his hearing in crowded spaces was supernaturally acute, a skill developed in childhood, when the difference between hearing his father's footsteps approaching and not hearing them was the difference between escape and a bruise. He said nothing, filed it, stored it in the vast, meticulously organized archive of grievances that lived behind his calm exterior. Eveline stood near the window, speaking with Mrs. Crawford, and Cedric watched her with the peripheral attention of a man who appeared to be looking elsewhere. She held her champagne but did not drink it. She smiled when spoken to, but the smile did not reach her eyes. It stopped at her mouth the way a train stops at a station, pausing only long enough to be polite before moving on. She was performing. And she was good at it, good enough that most people would never notice. But Cedric had spent 38 years studying the gap between what people showed and what people hid, and he could see the machinery behind her composure as clearly as a clockmaker sees the gears inside a watch. She was exhausted, she was frightened, and she was so profoundly alone in a room full of people that it radiated off her like heat from a stone wall after sundown. A young Viscount, Lord Ashton, 24, handsome in the bland way of men who have never suffered, approached Evelyn and said something that made her stiffen. Cedric could not hear the words, but he could read her body, the slight withdrawal of her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened around the champagne glass stem. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He did not hurry. Hurrying was for men who doubted their own authority. He simply moved, and the crowd parted the way crowds always parted for him, not out of courtesy, but out of the ancient animal instinct that tells prey to move away from the thing at the top of the chain. "Lord Ashton," Cedric's voice was pleasant. This was when he was most dangerous. Ashton turned. The color left his face in a slow drain, like water leaving a tub. "Your Grace, I was merely congratulating your lovely bride." "Were you?" Yes. Simply offering my felicitations. Cedric stood close enough that Ashton had to look up to meet his eyes. The height difference was only 3 inches, but Cedric knew how to use space the way a general knows how to use terrain. Every inch a strategic advantage. My wife's name is Lady Ravenshire. When you address her, you will use her title. When you approach her, you will do so at a respectful distance. And when you speak to her, you will remember that anything you say to her, you are saying to me. Are we clear? Ashton's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Perfectly clear, Your Grace. Good. Enjoy the champagne. It is excellent. Ashton retreated so quickly he nearly knocked over a serving tray. Cedric turned to Evelyn, who was watching him with an expression he could not immediately categorize. It was not gratitude, too sharp for gratitude. Not anger, too quiet for anger. It was something closer to assessment. She was recalculating him, adjusting whatever model she had built of who he was and what he wanted. That was unnecessary, she said. That is a matter of perspective. He was harmless. Harmless men do not make women flinch. She went still. He had seen it. The flinch. She knew he had seen it, and now she knew something about the Duke of Ravenshire that most people never figured out. He watched, constantly, compulsively. The way some men drank or gambled, Cedric watched. It was his vice and his weapon, and the thing that kept him alive in rooms full of people who wanted him diminished. I can handle a foolish viscount, she said. I have no doubt, but you should not have to. Not here, not today. Something flickered in her gray eye. A micro-expression so brief that if he had blinked, he would have missed it. It was surprise, genuine surprise, and it told him more about her life than any dossier or background investigation ever could. Because surprise at basic decency is the hallmark of someone who has lived without it for so long they have stopped expecting it. He walked away before she could respond. He was not ready for her gratitude. He was not sure he deserved it. He had defended her not because he was kind. He knew himself well enough to know that kindness was not his natural register, but because she was his name, his household, his responsibility. And Cedric Ravenshire did not allow anyone to damage what was his. The distinction between protection and possession was one he had not yet learned to make. The wedding breakfast ended at 3. The guests left in a steady procession of carriages and calculated farewells, and by 4 o'clock the townhouse was empty and silent, and Cedric stood in his study pouring a second whiskey he did not need. Morris appeared in the doorway. Lady Ravenshire has been shown to her chambers. She asked if dinner would be formal or private. Private. Have cook prepare something simple. She looks like she has not had a proper meal in months. She has not, Your Grace. Mrs. Crawford reports that the dress required significant alteration. Lady Ravenshire is considerably thinner than her measurements from 6 weeks ago. Cedric set the bottle down. Thinner. By Mrs. Crawford's estimate, nearly a stone lighter. He stood very still. The whiskey in his glass did not move. She has been in the Whitmore household for the past 6 weeks. Yes, Your Grace. Being fed by the Whitmore household. Ostensibly. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes storms. Not empty, but packed with energy, compressed and waiting. Morris had seen that silence before. It usually ended badly for whoever had caused it. Find out, Cedric said. Everything. How she was treated, what she was given, what she was denied. Every detail. Yes, Your Grace. And Morris. Your Grace, if the Whitmores have starved her, I want to know before I sit across from Lord Whitmore at any table ever again. Because the next conversation I have with that man will be significantly different depending on the answer. Morris left. Cedric drank his whiskey and stared at the rain starting up again outside the window, and inside his chest, the crack widened by another fraction of an inch. Dinner was served at 7 in the small dining room, a space that could seat 12, but tonight held only 2, positioned at opposite ends of a table that might as well have been a continent. Candles threw unsteady light across the silver. The food was simple as ordered: roasted chicken, potatoes, greens, bread. Nothing extravagant, nothing performative. Eveline sat with her napkin in her lap and her spine perfectly straight, and she ate the way a person eats when they are trying not to reveal how hungry they are. Small bites, measured pace, jaw barely moving. She was rationing her own relief, and the discipline of it was both impressive and devastating. You may eat without restraint, Cedric said from his end of the table. There is no audience here. She looked up. Her fork paused mid-cut. I am eating. You are performing eating. There is a difference. A long pause. Then something extraordinary happened, something so small and so human that it nearly broke the formality of the evening in half. She put down her fork, looked directly at him with those gray stone-wall eyes, and said, "Is it your habit to observe how your servants eat, or only your wife?" He almost smiled. Almost. The muscles around his mouth shifted a quarter degree and then stopped, as though his face had forgotten the mechanics. "You are not my servant. Then perhaps you might extend me the courtesy of not monitoring my food intake as though I were a horse being assessed at auction." The words landed in the space between them with a clean, sharp precision that Cedric recognized instantly. This was not rudeness. This was not rebellion. This was a woman who had spent years having her behavior policed by people who had no right to police it, and she had reached the absolute limit of her tolerance for being observed and found wanting. He put down his own fork. "You are right. That was a poor observation, poorly delivered. I apologize." She blinked. The surprise again? That flicker, that tiny fracture in her composure that told him no one apologized to this woman, ever, for anything. "Accepted," she said. And then, after a moment, she took a full, unapologetic bite of chicken, and Cedric felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with the candlelight or the rain. They ate in silence after that, but it was a different silence than the carriage, warmer by 1 degree. The difference between ice and cold water, still uncomfortable, but no longer hostile. After dinner, they separated. Cedric to his study, Eveline to her chambers. The arrangement was understood without discussion. Separate rooms, separate lives, intersecting only when duty required. This was what he had planned. This was what he had wanted. A functional partnership. An heir, eventually. Nothing more. He sat at his desk and opened Edmund's letter, the one he had told Morris to burn. He read it with the detached precision of a man defusing a bomb. "Dearest cousin," it began, because Edmund always began his letters with a possessive endearment that made Cedric's teeth itch. "I write to offer my most sincere congratulations on your upcoming nuptials. How wonderful that the ancient Ravenshire name will be carried forward through this most auspicious union. I do hope that Lady Whitmore, forgive me, Lady Ravenshire, will find happiness in her new station. It is no small thing to ascend from obscurity to a dukedom, and I trust that the adjustment will be managed with the grace and dignity befitting our family." Grace and dignity. Cedric could hear Edmund's voice behind the words, smooth, oiled, calibrated to sound warm, while communicating nothing but contempt. Lady Whitmore from obscurity. Not even the courtesy of using her married name correctly. The entire letter was a masterwork of passive aggression, every sentence a needle wrapped in silk. "I confess some concern, cousin, about the rapidity of the arrangement. I know the Duchess's health weighs heavily upon you, and I would never suggest that urgency has clouded your judgment. But the ton does talk, and there are those who wonder whether the match was made with sufficient consideration for the family's standing. Rest assured, I have defended you vigorously against such whispers. You can always count on your family." Cedric set the letter down. He did not burn it. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, alongside the other two. Evidence was worth more than satisfaction, and Cedric had learned long ago that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who keeps receipts. He leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers to his temples. The headache had started during the ceremony and had been building steadily ever since, a slow, grinding pressure behind his eyes that whiskey dulled but could not kill. He was tired. Not the tiredness of a long day, but the tiredness of a long life lived in a defensive crouch. Every relationship a transaction, every conversation a potential threat assessment. And now there was a woman in his house. A real woman, not a portrait or a clause in a contract, but a person who ate chicken with quiet defiance and called him out for watching her and had gray eyes that saw more than they revealed. He had not planned for her to be real. That was the problem. He had planned for a function, wife, mother, duchess, and instead he had received a human being, with edges and wounds and a spine made of something he could not bend. Upstairs, Eveline sat at the vanity in her new chambers and stared at her reflection in the mirror. The room was enormous, 4 times the size of the attic space she had occupied at the Whitmore residence. The bed was canopied, the sheets were silk. There were flowers on the nightstand, fresh cut, and a fire in the grate that made the room feel almost human. She picked up the ring from where she had placed it on the vanity, turned it, watched the candlelight slide across the gold. She was the Duchess of Ravenshire, The words felt like a foreign language in her mouth. 6 weeks ago, she had been mending her cousin Catherine's stockings by candlelight in an attic that leaked in heavy rain. 6 weeks ago, Lord Whitmore had summoned her to his study and told her, without preamble or kindness, that a duke had made an offer and that she would accept it because the alternative was the street. "You should be grateful," her aunt had said afterward, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and her face arranged in the expression she used when she wanted Evelyn to feel small. "No one else would have you. 26 and plain as a fence post. This is your one chance, Evelyn. Do not ruin it. 26 and plain as a fence post." She had heard variations of this her entire adult life. Too thin, too quiet, too serious, too much her father's daughter. And her father, the late Lord Whitmore's younger brother, had been the family's great disgrace, a gambler and a drunk who had died in a debtor's prison when Evelyn was 12 and left her with nothing but his name and his shame. She had been passed to Lord Whitmore's household like a piece of furniture, functional, unremarkable, and stored in whatever room was least convenient to anyone else. She had raised their children while they went to parties. She had managed their household accounts when the housekeeper quit. She had sewn, cleaned, tutored, organized, and survived, and in return she had received a roof, irregular meals, and the constant corrosive reminder that she existed on charity and should never forget it. And now she was here, in silk sheets, in a duke's house, married to a man who looked at her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve before it exploded. She set the ring down and pressed her palms flat against the vanity's surface. The wood was cool and solid under her hands. She counted her breaths the way she always did when the world shifted too fast. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. A rhythm she had invented at 14, the first time her aunt had locked her in the cellar for talking back. She did not cry. She had stopped crying at 15, not because the pain had ended, but because she had realized that tears were a luxury she could not afford. They required energy and privacy, and the belief that someone might eventually care. She had none of those things, so she had converted her grief into something more useful: observation, patience, the ability to sit in a room full of people who despised her and catalog their weaknesses without them ever knowing she was doing it. It was this skill, this invisible, defensive intelligence, that had kept her alive in the Whitmore household. And it was this skill that she now turned on the Duke of Ravenshire with the full force of a woman who understood that survival depended on knowing exactly who you were dealing with. What she knew so far: he was not cruel. Cruel men did not apologize for monitoring her eating habits. Cruel men did not send seamstresses at 7 in the morning. Cruel men did not cross rooms in 4 strides to remove vice counts from her personal space. But he was dangerous. She could feel it the way animals feel weather, a pressure change, a charge in the air. His control was too perfect. His calm was too complete. Men who held themselves that tightly were either saints or volcanoes, and she had met enough men to know that saints were fictional. I was watching her. She had felt it all day. His attention, constant and meticulous, cataloging her the same way she cataloged him. And the terrifying thing was not that he was doing it. The terrifying thing was that he was good at it, better than anyone she had ever encountered. Most people looked at Evelyn and saw wallpaper. The Duke looked at her and saw the wall behind it. She stood up, removed the pins from her hair, and let it fall past her shoulders. In the mirror, without the too large ring and the not quite right dress, and the performance of composure, she looked exactly like what she was, a tired, thin woman who had been surviving for so long she had forgotten what living felt like. She climbed into the silk sheets and lay in the darkness, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that was now supposed to be her home. Somewhere below, she heard a door close. The Duke's study. His footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate, a man who moved through the world as though the world should accommodate him and not the other way around. The footsteps paused outside her door. She held her breath. 1 second, 2, 5. Then they moved on, down the hall. Another door opened and closed. She exhaled. And in the darkness of her first night as the Duchess of Ravenshire, Evelyn Whitmore made a decision. She would not love this man. Love was a trap. She had watched it destroy her father, watched it turn her mother into a ghost who died of pneumonia 2 years after her husband's imprisonment, because she had simply stopped caring whether she lived. Love was the thing people used to justify their worst decisions, and Evelyn had spent too many years cleaning up the wreckage of other people's worst decisions to volunteer for her own. She would be useful. She would be competent. She would fulfill whatever duties were required of a duchess, and she would do it with the same quiet efficiency she had applied to every impossible situation the Whitmores had thrown at her. And when the Duke grew bored, because men always grew bored, that was the one reliable truth about them, she would already have built a life within these walls that did not depend on his attention or his approval. This was her plan. It was practical. It was self-protective. It was the smartest strategy available to a woman in her position. It would fail spectacularly. But she did not know that yet. 3 days after the wedding, a carriage arrived at Ravenshire Manor carrying a trunk, 2 hat boxes, and Lord Edmund Ravenshire, who stepped onto the gravel drive with the smile of a man delivering a gift that was actually a grenade. Cedric was in his study when Morris brought the news. He did not rise. He did not hurry. He finished the sentence he was writing, a letter to his estate manager in Yorkshire regarding the winter wheat rotation, and then set down his pen with the precision of a man placing a chess piece. "Where is Lady Ravenshire?" "In the library, Your Grace. She has been organizing the collection since yesterday morning." Organizing it. "She discovered that your late father's system was, in her words, an insult to the concept of alphabetical order. She has been correcting it." Something moved across Cedric's face that might, under laboratory conditions, have been classified as amusement. "Tell her we have a guest. And Morris, watch him. Every room he enters, every servant he speaks to, every door he opens. I want a full accounting." "Understood, Your Grace." Cedric rose and went downstairs to meet his cousin in the drawing room, where Edmund had already installed himself in the best chair by the fire and was examining a porcelain shepherdess on the mantelpiece with the acquisitive eye of an auctioneer. "Cedric." Edmund turned with that smile, wide, warm, utterly synthetic. "Cousin, I had to come personally to offer my congratulations. Letters seem so inadequate for moments like these, don't you think? I think letters serve their purpose admirably when the sender has something worth saying." Edmund laughed. He always laughed at Cedric's sharpness, because acknowledging the blade meant acknowledging the threat, and Edmund preferred to pretend they were equals sharing a joke. "You haven't changed. Still the most charming man in England." "I was never charming. Sit down, Edmund. You are already here. We might as well be efficient about it." They sat. Tea was brought. Edmund talked about the weather, the parliamentary session, the shocking state of the roads between London and the countryside. He talked with the easy, lubricated flow of a man who used conversation the way Squid used ink, to obscure, to misdirect, to create a cloud behind which his real intentions moved unseen. Cedric let him talk. Patience was his sharpest weapon, and he wielded it now with surgical discipline, offering nothing, revealing nothing, simply waiting for the moment when Edmund's real purpose would surface like a body in a river. It came 17 minutes in. "And your bride," Edmund said, leaning forward with the expression of concerned kinship he had perfected in front of mirrors. "How is she adjusting? It must be such a tremendous change for her, from the Whitmore household to all of this." He gestured at the room, the ceiling, the fireplace, the centuries of accumulated wealth pressed into every surface. "She is adjusting well. I'm glad to hear it, truly. There was some concern, you understand, among the family, that the match was perhaps hasty, that a woman of her background might find the demands of the position overwhelming. The family's concern is noted and irrelevant." Edmund's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Of course. I meant no offense. I simply want what is best for the Ravenshire name, as we all do." The door opened. Evelyn entered. She had changed since the wedding. Not physically. 3 days was not enough to undo years of insufficient nutrition. But something in her carriage had shifted. She moved through the doorway of the drawing room with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent the last 72 hours learning the geography of her new domain and had decided, consciously or not, that it was hers. Lady Ravenshire. Edmund rose, and his eyes made a fast, clinical sweep of her face, figure, dress, posture. The assessment of a man calculating whether a threat was real or manageable. "What an absolute pleasure. I have heard so much about you." "And I about you, Mr. Ravenshire." Evelyn's voice was level, polite, impenetrable. "Your letters to the Duke have been quite frequent." A beat. Cedric, watching from his chair, caught it. The fractional pause in Edmund's performance, the half-second where the mask slipped, and something cold and calculating looked out from behind those charming eyes. "I am a devoted family man," Edmund said, recovering. "Correspondence is the lifeblood of kinship." "Indeed." Evelyn sat in the chair opposite Cedric, and the triangulation of the three of them created a geometry that Edmund had not anticipated. Husband and wife on 2 points, him alone on the third. I trust your visit will be brief? The Duke has a great deal of estate business to attend to, and I would hate for him to fall behind on account of social obligations. She said it with a smile, a real smile, or at least a convincing enough one that most men would have accepted it at face value. But Cedric saw the steel behind it, and for the second time in 3 days, something cracked inside his chest. She was protecting him, this woman who owed him nothing, who had every reason to stand aside and let his cousin waste his afternoon, was positioning herself as a barrier between Edmund's intrusion and Cedric's time. And she was doing it so smoothly, so naturally, that Edmund could not object without looking petty. Edmund stayed for 2 hours. He toured the house. He complimented the furnishings. He asked subtle questions about the estate's finances that Cedric deflected with the ease of long practice. And when he finally left, climbing back into his carriage with his trunk and his hat boxes and his thwarted ambitions, Cedric stood at the window of his study and watched the carriage disappear down the drive. Eveline appeared in the doorway behind him. He could see her reflection in the glass. Your cousin is going to be a problem, she said. He did not turn around. Yes. He was cataloging the silverware. I saw him counting place settings in the dining room. You noticed that. I notice everything, Your Grace. It is the only advantage of being invisible for most of your life. People forget you are in the room. He turned then, looked at her. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her gray eyes steady and her chin at that level, enduring angle that he was beginning to understand was not submission but architecture, the structural engineering of a woman who had built herself to withstand pressure. You are not invisible, he said. Not in this house. Not anymore. She held his gaze, held it the way she held the too large ring, carefully, deliberately, with the awareness that it might slip away at any moment. We shall see, she said, and left. Cedric stood alone in his study as the evening darkened outside the windows and the fire crackled and the vast empty manor settled around him like a living thing drawing breath. He thought about the way she had handled Edmund. No dramatics, no confrontation, just quiet, surgical precision. He thought about her in the library, reorganizing his dead father's chaos into something functional. He thought about the way she had said, I notice everything with no pride, no bitterness, just the flat acknowledgement of a skill born from necessity. And he thought, with a clarity that frightened him more than any threat Edmund could manufacture, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had married a function, a solution to a dying woman's wish, a warm body to occupy a title and produce an heir and fade into the wallpaper of his carefully controlled existence. Instead, he had married a person, a real, thinking, watching, enduring person who was already rearranging the furniture of his life without asking permission. And the crack in his chest, the one that had started in the church when she walked down the aisle alone, spread another inch, silent and irreversible, like a fault line shifting in the dark. That night, for the first time in 11 years, Cedric Ravenshire locked his study door, poured a third whiskey, and sat in the dark wondering what the hell he had done. 2 floors above him, his wife lay awake in silk sheets, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around her. She was thinking about his face when she had said your cousin is going to be a problem. The way his expression had not changed, had not needed to change, because the acknowledgement was already there, underneath the stone, and all she had done was name it. He had looked at her then, the way no one had ever looked at her, not with pity, not with obligation, not with the appraising calculation of a man measuring a woman's usefulness. He had looked at her as though she were dangerous. And Evelyn Whitmore, Evelyn Ravenshire, who had sworn 3 nights ago that she would never love this man, felt something move in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. She turned over, closed her eyes, told herself it was nothing. Below her, in the locked study, the Duke poured another drink and thought about gray eyes. And outside the manor, the English countryside stretched dark and vast in every direction, and the wind carried the sound of something beginning that neither of them could stop. A sound like a wall cracking, like ice breaking, like 2 people falling toward each other from opposite ends of a silence that was no longer strong enough to hold. In the morning, a letter would arrive, sealed in black wax, addressed to Lady Ravenshire, no return name, and everything, the careful distance, the guarded hearts, the controlled architecture of 2 people pretending they did not need each other, would begin to collapse. The letter arrived at 7:40 in the morning, carried by a boy no older than 12, who handed it to the footman at the front door and ran before anyone thought to ask where it came from. Black wax. No crest. No return address. Just Eveline's name on the front, written in a hand she did not recognize, slanted hard to the left, the way people write when they are trying to disguise themselves, and do not know that the attempt always reveals more than the original. She was at breakfast when Morris brought it in on a silver tray, and she felt Cedric's attention shift before she even touched the envelope. I was seated at the head of the table with a newspaper open and a cup of coffee going cold beside it, and he had not spoken since she sat down, which she had already learned was his natural morning state. Not hostile, just compressed, a man who needed an hour before he was willing to engage with the world as though the world deserved engagement. But when Morris set the tray down, the newspaper stopped moving. Evelyn looked at the letter, looked at the black wax, picked it up. "You do not recognize the hand," Cedric said. It was not a question. "No." "Then don't open it alone." She met his eyes across the table. The directness of him was still something she was calibrating. Most men who gave orders dressed them in courtesy or framed them as suggestions, but Cedric's instructions arrived naked, stripped of all social upholstery, and the bluntness of it was either insufferable or honest, depending on how much energy she had to be offended. This morning she did not have the energy. She slit the wax with a butter knife. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No salutation, no signature. Just 11 words in that same leftward slanting hand. "You do not belong here. Leave before you are removed." She read it twice, set it down, picked up her tea. Cedric reached across the table and took the letter before she could stop him. He read it. His face did not change, not a muscle, not a breath, but his hand, holding the paper, went very still in the specific way a hand goes still when the body is redirecting energy away from its extremities and into its core. She had seen that stillness before, the night of the wedding breakfast when he had crossed the room toward Ashton. It was the stillness that preceded action. "This was hand-delivered," he said. "Yes." The boy did not wait. "No." He folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. "Eat your breakfast." "I am not particularly hungry." "Eat it anyway." He picked up his newspaper, opened it, and then, without looking at her, said in a voice so low it was almost below the register of normal speech, "Someone is trying to frighten you in your own house. The most efficient response is to be unfrightened." She looked at his profile, the hard jaw, the scar, the absolute refusal to perform concern, and understood that this was, for Cedric Ravenshire, the closest thing to comfort he was capable of manufacturing. Not reassurance, not warmth, just operational clarity. Here's the problem, here's the solution, execute. She ate her breakfast. Afterward, while Cedric was in his study with the estate's London solicitor, Evelyn went to the library. Not to hide, she did not hide, that was the Whitmore household, that was the old geography, and she had decided with the rigidity of someone who has made one too many desperate choices that she was done navigating by old maps. She went to the library because there was work to do, and work had always been the mechanism by which she converted anxiety into something she could stand behind. The Ravenshire Library held 4,000 volumes in a state of organizational chaos that she had spent 2 days beginning to remedy. The late Duke's system appeared to have been based on no discernible principle. History shelved beside poetry, law beside horticulture. A first edition of Locke wedged horizontally above a stack of hunting almanacs. She had pulled everything from the eastern wall and begun rebuilding it with the focused intensity of someone who needed to make order out of at least one small corner of the world. She was on the second shelf when she heard the door. Not Morris. Not Cedric. She already knew the weight of his footsteps, the deliberate way he occupied space. This was lighter, more careful. Someone who was trying not to make sound, which was, of course, the surest way to create it. She turned. A woman stood in the doorway. 22, perhaps 23. Dark hair. A face assembled from excellent raw materials into a result that fell just short of beautiful through no fault of the components. Too much awareness of its own arrangement, too much practiced effect. She wore a riding habit of deep blue that had been bought recently and expensively, and she looked at Evelyn the way a person looks at furniture they are considering replacing. "Lady Ravenshire." The woman's voice was warm in the way of things that are warm by calculation. "I hope I am not intruding. The footman said you were here." "You have a name," Evelyn said. It was not rude, it was simply an observation that a name had not yet been provided, and that the social machinery required one. A beat. Miss Helena Marsh, I am your neighbor. My father's estate borders Ravenshire to the north. The Duke and I have been acquainted for several years. Eveline noted the phrasing. Not friends, not neighbors, acquainted. A word chosen with the precision of a woman who wanted to imply something she was not prepared to state directly. How pleasant, Evelyn said. What can I do for you, Miss Marsh? Helena drifted into the room with the proprietary ease of someone accustomed to entering it uninvited. She ran a finger along the spines of the books Eveline had not yet reshelved, and the gesture was so perfectly calculated, casual, territorial, designed to communicate familiarity with a space that Eveline was still learning, that Eveline felt a flicker of something she identified immediately and locked away just as fast. Not jealousy. She refused jealousy. It was a resource expenditure she could not justify. But awareness, sharp and cold, of the game being played and the pieces on the board. I came to welcome you, Helena said. The neighborhood has been waiting to meet you. You made quite an impression at the wedding. Did I? Everyone was surprised. Helena turned from the bookshelf. Her eyes moved over Evelyn with that same acquisitive sweep Edmund had used. Fast, clinical, looking for weakness, the way a creditor looks for assets. Cedric has always been so particular. No one expected, well, a quiet match. I imagine the Duke's choices rarely require external approval. Helena smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has just received confirmation of a suspicion she already held. No, they don't. She paused, and in the pause Eveline heard everything Helena was not saying. The history of those years of acquaintance, the precise nature of their particular familiarity, the unspoken claim that existed in the space between the words chosen and the words available. I only want to say that the position of Duchess at Ravenshire is not uncomplicated. The house has expectations. The county has expectations. And Cedric has expectations that he will never articulate because he considers articulation a form of weakness. That is an intimate observation about my husband's character, Evelyn said. I know him well. Then you know that unsolicited advice regarding his household would irritate him considerably. A silence. The fire crackled. Dust moved in a beam of morning light between them. I am trying to help you, Helena said, and the warmth in her voice dropped half a register. Still there, but thinner now, the calculation more visible through it. You are trying to establish something, Evelyn said. I don't yet know exactly what, but I appreciate the visit. She turned back to the bookshelf, picked up a volume. Mrs. Hartley will show you out. She did not watch Helena leave. She heard the door, the careful, controlled close of a woman who was too composed to slam it and too angry not to want to. And then she stood with a copy of Burke's Peerage open in her hands and stared at the pages without reading them and let the adrenaline run through her blood and out the other side, because adrenaline, like grief, was only useful in motion and destructive if held still. When Cedric came to find her at noon, she was 4 shelves further along, and the room smelled of old paper and cold air, and the particular charged quality of a space where something has recently been decided. He stood in the doorway, looked at her, looked at the reshelved volumes. Helena Marsh was here. Yes. Morris told me. Of course he did. Cedric stepped into the room. He moved to the center of it and stood there with his hands behind his back, which she had identified as his default position when he was thinking. Not pacing, not sitting, just standing at the axis of a space and turning the problem in his mind. What did she say? She offered to help me understand my position. Evelyn slid a volume into place. I declined. She has been a regular visitor to the manor for 4 years. I gathered that. She is also... He stopped. The pause was brief, but she felt it. The way you feel a skip in a heartbeat, the tiny interruption in a rhythm you have begun to unconsciously track. She expected a different outcome. Before my mother's illness changed my timeline. Evelyn did not turn around. She kept her hands on the books, and her voice even, and made the deliberate choice to engage with what he was actually telling her, rather than the 10 things he was not. Then she is angry. She is strategic, Cedric said. There is a difference. Anger makes you obvious. Strategy makes you dangerous. The letter this morning. Another pause, shorter. I don't know yet. She turned then, looked at him. He was watching her with that same unsettling focus. The attention of a man who was used to reading rooms and had discovered a person whose interior was more interesting than the rooms he usually inhabited. "Are you warning me," she said, "or informing me?" "Both." He held her gaze. "You are in a house full of people who had existing loyalties before you arrived. Some of those loyalties are to me. Some are to the idea of this place, which is not the same thing. And some, the faintest tightening of his jaw, are to whoever they think might hold power here 6 months from now." "You mean Edmund?" "I mean anyone who is not convinced this marriage will last." The words landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ring spread outward in silence. Because what he was telling her beneath the operational language was that she was being tested, not by him, by the house, by the county, by the entire apparatus of expectation and social calculation that surrounded a dukedom and had found, in the person of the new duchess, an uncertainty it intended to exploit. "Then we should give them certainty," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she became aware of the quality of his attention in a physical way, the way you become aware of heat from a fire when you step closer than you intended. "Yes," he said. "We should." It started that afternoon. Not with a declaration or a strategy session, but with a simple act. Cedric walked with her through the east wing of the manor, the wing that had been closed since his father's death, and he showed her the rooms. Everyone. Including the one at the end of the corridor where the curtains were still drawn, and the fireplace had not been lit in 6 years, and the desk in the corner still held his father's correspondence. Unopened, bound in twine, abandoned mid-sentence. The way everything the old Duke had ever touched had been abandoned mid-sentence, including his son. Cedric stood in that room with his hands behind his back, and his jaw set, and his eyes moving over the contents, with the controlled blankness of a man looking at something he has trained himself not to see. "I kept it closed," he said. "It seemed necessary at the time." Eveline looked at the desk, at the bound correspondence, at the portrait above the fireplace, the 5th Duke of Ravenshire, painted at 40, wearing his authority like armor and his cruelty like cologne. The resemblance to Cedric was there, the height, the bone structure, but where Cedric's face was controlled, the father's was simply cold, the cold of absence rather than compression. A man who had never bothered containing himself because containment implied that something inside was worth protecting. "What was he like?" she said. Not really a question. Cedric was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Efficient," he said finally. The word was so precisely chosen, so stripped of everything that the word did not cover, that Eveline felt it in her sternum. Because efficiency was what you called a man who had done damage with no wasted motion and left no room for appeal. "The East Wing," she said, "could be functional. The rooms have good light. With the furniture moved and the correspondence dealt with, the correspondence can be burned. Some of it might be important. None of it is important." His voice was flat and final, a door closing. "Burn it." She did not argue. Some doors she had learned in 26 years of watching people protect themselves were not locked against you. They were locked against everything. They walked back through the corridor in silence, and somewhere between the east wing and the main hall, a small, unremarkable thing happened that Eveline would not fully understand the weight of until much later. Cedric slowed his pace, just slightly, unconsciously, matching his stride to hers rather than requiring her to match his. She noticed. She said nothing. She filed it away in the growing archive of small, precise observations she was building about this man. The way she had always built such archives about the people she depended on for survival, cataloging their habits and patterns and pressure points, not to exploit them, but to navigate them. Because navigation was the only power available to someone who had never been given a room of her own. Except now she had one. She had 4,000 of them. And the man walking beside her had, consciously or not, just told her something about who he was becoming in relation to who he had always been. The dinner that evening was the first one they ate at the same end of the table. Cedric moved his setting himself. No instruction, no explanation, just the scrape of silver on wood and the appearance of his plate 6 seats closer. Eveline watched him do it over the rim of her wine glass and made no comment, because some moments are larger than the language available for them, and the best response is to let them breathe. They talked. About the East Wing. About the estate account she had been reviewing. She had asked Morris for the ledgers that morning, a request that had produced a 30-second silence before Morris produced them, with the expression of a man who had just recalibrated an assumption he had held for years. The accounts were functional but inefficient, the household expenditures poorly categorized, 3 recurring line items that appeared to benefit parties outside the estate. The feed supplier, she said. The contract was written in 1847 and has never been renegotiated. The rate is nearly double the current market rate. Cedric looked at her. You read the accounts. I managed the Whitmore household accounts for 4 years. I can read a ledger. My estate manager has managed those contracts for, I know, which is why no one noticed. She held his gaze. I am not criticizing your people. I am telling you what I saw. A pause. The candlelight moved between them. He was doing the thing again. The recalibration, the internal adjustment of a model that had been built on incomplete data. She could see it in the slight shift of his eyes, the way they focused and refocused, as though looking at a different focal point. Renegotiate it, he said. You'll need to instruct Mr. Hale. I'll need to instruct no one. You are the Duchess of Ravenshire. The household accounts are your domain. Renegotiate it yourself. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a woman absorbing, with great care and without any display whatsoever, a word she had not heard directed at herself in so long it felt foreign, authority, not borrowed, not conditional, hers. All right, she said. All right, he agreed, and picked up his fork. And they finished dinner in a silence that had changed its temperature entirely. No longer cold, not yet warm, but the specific ambient temperature of 2 people who are beginning, incrementally, and with great mutual suspicion, to trust. Later that night, Cedric sat alone in his study with Edmund's letters spread across the desk and the anonymous letter beside them, and he looked at what was in front of him with the methodical attention of a man constructing a case rather than nursing a wound. 3 letters from Edmund in 4 weeks, each progressively warmer in tone and progressively more precise in its intelligence about the estate's internal affairs, servant movements, financial arrangements, the status of the Duchess's health, information that required a source inside the household. Each letter building, brick by invisible brick, a narrative. The Duke is aging. The marriage is a desperation measure. The succession is uncertain. The natural heir is waiting patiently. It was a long game. Edmund was playing it well. And the anonymous letter to Eveline, crude by comparison, blunt where Edmund was surgical, was either Edmund subcontracting his fear or someone else entirely, someone with less patience and more urgency. Cedric pressed 2 fingers to the scar on his jaw. An old habit, not of comfort, because he did not believe in comfort, but of grounding. The scar was real. The desk was real. The game being played around him was real, and he was the prize at the center of it, which meant that everyone around him was either an asset or a liability, and the margin for error in distinguishing between the two was approximately 0. Eveline was neither. She was something he had not factored, a variable that had arrived with its own agenda and its own intelligence and its own refusal to be categorized, and the refusal was the problem, not because it threatened him, but because it interested him, and interest was the thing he had spent the last decade most successfully eliminating from his life. He picked up Edmund's most recent letter. Read it again. And caught this time a single sentence he had processed but not weighed. I do hope that the recent staffing changes have not disrupted the household too greatly. He had made no staffing changes. He had not mentioned any staffing changes in any correspondence. And yet Edmund knew there had been ones, minor ones, Mrs. Crawford's addition, the reassignment of 2 footmen to accommodate a duchess's chambers. Someone in this house was sending information to Edmund Ravenshire, regularly, specifically. Cedric sat very still for a long moment. Then he stood, went to the door, opened it, and found Morris standing approximately where Morris always stood when the Duke was in his study late, and the house was quiet, close enough to be summoned, far enough to be ignored. In the morning, Cedric said, I want a full accounting of every servant who has had any contact with my cousin's household in the last 60 days. Correspondence, visitors, errands into the village, every point of contact. Morris did not blink. Yes, Your Grace. And wake me if anything comes in overnight. Letters, messengers, anything. Of course. Cedric closed the door, stood in the center of his study, let the shape of the problem settle over him the way cold water settles, complete, immediate, inescapable. His cousin wanted the dukedom. His neighbor wanted his attention. Someone in his household was feeding both. And upstairs, in silk sheets she was still getting used to, was a woman with gray eyes who could read a ledger and manage a library and deflect a threat with the precision of someone who had been doing it her entire life and had never once been backed up. He thought about her face when he told her to renegotiate the contract herself. The way she had gone very still, not surprised but absorbing, the way dry ground absorbs rain after a long drought, thoroughly and without drama. He thought about what it cost, over years, to be given nothing and told you deserved less. What it did to a person's architecture, how it built walls, yes, but also how it built skill, because deprivation was the most ruthless teacher available, and it never graduated anyone without a working knowledge of survival. She had survived the Whitmores. She had walked down an aisle alone and arrived at the altar without breaking. She had read his household accounts in a single morning and identified a contract discrepancy his estate manager had missed for 6 years. She had handled Helena Marsh without raising her voice or losing her composure, and she had done all of it while navigating a new house, a new title, and an unknown husband, and she had not once asked him to make it easier. Cedric sat down at his desk, opened the bottom drawer, removed a small, locked box that held correspondence of a different kind. Not business, not social, personal. The kind that men who do not keep diaries keep instead. 3 letters from his mother, written in the last months before her illness progressed to silence. He did not open them. He held the box for a moment, the weight of it familiar, and then set it down and looked at the wall and thought about his mother's voice saying, "Is she kind?" And his own inadequate answer, "She is not cruel." No, he thought now, she is not. But he had been wrong about the category. Kindness was not the absence of cruelty. He could see that now, having watched her for 6 days with the attention he gave to things that mattered. Kindness was not softness or sentiment or the willingness to overlook injury for the sake of peace. Kindness was the choice, made deliberately and at real cost, to treat people as though they deserved consideration they had not yet earned. He had watched her with servants. He had watched her with Morris, with Cook, with the 2 housemaids who had been waiting to see whether the new Duchess was the kind of woman who looked through them or at them. Evelyn looked at them, learned their names the first day, asked Cook about the supplier situation directly, without going through Morris, which was technically a breach of household hierarchy, but so practically sensible that Morris had simply updated his mental map of her and moved on. She was not kind because she was soft. She was kind because she understood, at some cellular level that suffering had carved into her, what it felt like to be invisible, and she had made a choice about what to do with that understanding. And Cedric, who had spent 38 years choosing precision over warmth and efficiency, over connection and the clean mathematics of power, over the messy variables of human need, sat in his study at midnight and felt for the first time since his mother got sick that there was something in this house worth the trouble of protecting. Not possessing, not controlling, protecting. The distinction was new. He was not sure what to do with it yet. At 1 in the morning, there was a knock at his study door. Not Morris's knock. Lighter, hesitant, the knock of someone who had walked to the door 3 times and turned back twice before finally committing. "Come in," he said. The door opened. Eveline stood in the hallway in a wool robe over her nightgown, her hair loose and dark around her pale shoulders, holding a single candle that threw her face into dramatic relief. Cheekbones, jaw, those stone-gray eyes that now held something they had not held in daylight. Not fear. Something adjacent to it. The particular expression of a person who has been lying in the dark, adding numbers that keep coming out wrong. "I heard something," she said. "In the east corridor, footsteps." He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Not rushing, Cedric did not rush. Rushing was a declaration of vulnerability. But moving with the efficient speed of a man who has been waiting without knowing he was waiting for something to require his full capability. "Show me." She led him up the stairs and down the east corridor, the candle barely holding against the drafts, and he walked half a step behind her and watched the shadows and listened with the total physical attention of a man who had grown up in a house where sounds in the dark had consequences. The corridor was empty, silent. But at the far end, near the door to his father's room, the floor showed a thin scattering of plaster dust that had not been there when they'd walked through that afternoon. Cedric crouched, looked at the dust, looked up at the ceiling, the plaster molding, old and cracked, intact. Then at the door, the handle. Faint. Almost nothing. The ghost of a fingerprint on old brass where the surface had been breathed on by something warm. He stood, turned to Eveline, who was watching him with the candle held steady and her face unreadable. "Someone was in here tonight," he said. The candle did not waver. Her voice did not waver. But something moved through her eyes. the final, irrevocable closure of a hope she had been maintaining in small, quiet installments since the morning the letter arrived. The hope that this was manageable, that the threat was external, theoretical, a distant pressure she could calculate and prepare for from behind the walls she had spent a lifetime constructing. "It's inside the house," she said. Yes, she looked at him. He looked at her. The candle between them threw their shadows long and intersecting against the corridor wall. And Cedric Ravenshire, who had spent 38 years building a life that required nothing and no one, felt the last viable argument for distance dissolve entirely, replaced by something far more dangerous than attraction or admiration or any of the manageable emotions he had long since catalogued and contained. He felt the absolute and unambiguous certainty that he would burn down everything he had built before he let anyone harm this woman. The thought arrived without ceremony, without the performance of realization, just a fact, cold and clean and permanent, settling into the architecture of who he was the way a load-bearing wall settles, deeply, invisibly, and in a way that would make the entire structure collapse if you tried to remove it. "Go back to your room," he said. His voice was steady. Everything was steady. "Lock the door. I will handle this." "You don't know who—" "No, but I will." She searched his face for something, reassurance perhaps, or the familiar calculation she had learned to read in him, and found instead something she had never expected to find there. Not warmth, not tenderness, something harder and more absolute than either. She turned and walked back toward the main wing. He watched until she rounded the corner and the candlelight disappeared, and then he turned back to the door of his father's room, and the fingerprint on the brass handle, and the implications spreading outward from both like rings in still water. Someone in his house had been in this corridor tonight. Someone who knew which wing would be dark, which servants would be asleep, and which room held the correspondence his new wife had suggested dealing with. Correspondence that might, if his father's habits had run as deep as Cedric suspected, contain things that certain people would prefer stayed burned. He reached into his jacket pocket, touched Edmund's letter, felt the paper's edge sharp against his fingertip. The game, it turned out, had moved inside the walls. He found the source at dawn, not through interrogation or elaborate investigation, through the oldest method available to a man who had spent his life reading rooms. He simply stood in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, unannounced, and watched the household wake up. And what he saw was this. Thomas, the youngest footman, 17 years old, second son of a tenant farmer in the village, moved through his morning tasks with the careful mechanical performance of someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Not lazy, not slow, occupied. The specific internal occupation of a person carrying a secret that had grown heavier than they anticipated when they first agreed to carry it. Cedric watched him for 4 minutes. Then he said quietly, from the doorway where no one had noticed him standing, "Thomas, my study. Now." The boy's hands went still on the silver he was polishing. The color left his face in a slow, visible tide. And in that draining, Cedric saw everything he needed to see before a single word was spoken. The guilt, the fear, the particular quality of fear that belongs not to a person caught doing something they believed in, but to a person caught doing something they already knew was wrong and had been doing anyway because the alternative had felt impossible. In the study, the boy stood in front of the desk, and Cedric sat behind it, and the distance between them was the distance between two entirely different kinds of power. One inherited, one borrowed, and both of them now at the same table. "How long?" Cedric said. Thomas stared at the carpet. His jaw worked. "Your Grace, I never meant—" "That is not what I asked. How long have you been reporting to my cousin's household?" A silence. Long enough that Cedric could hear the fire in the grate and the birds starting up outside the window, and the internal sound of a 17-year-old boy understanding that lying was no longer an available option. 8 months, Your Grace. 8 months. Before the engagement, before the dying Duchess's request, before Eveline had arrived and altered the geometry of everything. Edmund had been seeding intelligence inside this house for 8 months, patient and methodical, building his network in the walls the way rot builds in timber. Invisible, progressive, and by the time you see it, the damage is already structural. What did you tell him? Household movements, Your Grace. Which rooms were in use? When the Duchess, the late Duchess, had good days and bad. When you traveled to London. The staff schedules. Thomas's voice had dropped to almost nothing. He said it was just family concern.
that he only wanted to know you were all right, that there was nothing wrong with keeping family informed.
Cedric looked at the boy for a long moment. 17. Second son of a tenant farmer. Paid £12 a year. Edmund would have offered 3 times that for a month's information and called it a gift rather than a wage, because the framing was everything. It was not corruption. It was family loyalty. It was nothing wrong. It was just information, and by the time the boy understood what he had been made into, the hook was already set.
Did you let someone into the East Wing last night?
Thomas's head came up. The surprise on his face was genuine. Cedric had spent enough years reading deception to recognize its absence. No, Your Grace, I swear it. I haven't been near the East Wing. I didn't know anyone. He stopped. Something shifted behind his eyes. Mr. Harrow might know. Cedric went very still. Harrow. He asked me last week where you kept the East Wing key. I thought it was for... I don't know what I thought. I didn't ask. Harrow. Robert Harrow. Cedric's estate steward for 9 years, 51 years old. Former military, like Morris, but unlike Morris, not the kind of military that built a man, the kind that hollowed one out. Harrow had managed the estate's accounts, the tenant relations, the supplier contracts, the maintenance schedules. He knew every room in this house, every key, every weakness, and he had been renegotiating the feed supplier's contract, or rather, conspicuously not renegotiating it, for the past 6 years while billing the difference somewhere that was going to be very interesting to trace. The 2 facts arrived simultaneously in Cedric's mind and assembled themselves into a shape so clean and so damning that for a moment he simply sat with the weight of it, not with disbelief, because men who have been betrayed before do not have the luxury of disbelief, but with the specific gravity of a man who has just understood that the problem is not at the edges of his house, but at its center. He sent Thomas out with a warning that constituted the boy's last chance, and the clear understanding that the next communication to Edmund's household would be his final act as a Ravenshire employee. He was not merciful by nature, but he was precise about where mercy served strategy. And a frightened 17-year-old boy with a guilty conscience was a better asset as a turned informant than as a dismissed one who went running back to Edmund with news of exposure. Then he went to find Harrow. He did not find him. Harrow's room in the servants' wing was empty, the bed made with the particular neatness of a man who had made it for the last time. His personal effects were gone. A small locked box that sat on his dresser, Cedric knew of it, had never asked about it, the privacy of servants being one of the few boundaries he maintained, had been forced open and emptied, the lock broken from inside, the lid bent back. Whatever it had held, Harrow had taken it. He had left in the night, after the East Wing. Cedric stood in the empty room and looked at the open box and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, the cold, flat reality of having been outmaneuvered. Not defeated, not destroyed, but moved like a chess piece by a hand he had not seen. Harrow had been in his father's room last night, had accessed correspondence that Evelyn had suggested burning and that Cedric had agreed to burn without yet burning, had taken whatever he came for and was now gone to wherever Edmund's money had arranged for him to be gone to, which meant Edmund had wanted whatever was in that correspondence badly enough to accelerate his timeline, badly enough to risk exposure, badly enough to move a piece he had been saving, which meant the letter he had been building toward was nearly ready to send, and the information in his father's room was the last thing he needed before he sent it. Cedric walked back through the east corridor in the early morning light and stood outside his father's room and went inside for the second time in 6 years. The correspondence was there, most of it. The twine had been cut. Several bundles were missing, their spaces visible in the dust like outlines at a crime scene. He did not need to know which ones were gone to understand what they contained. His father had been a man of specific appetites and flexible ethics, and whatever documentation existed of both would be worth a considerable amount to a man trying to build a case for removing the current duke and repositioning the succession. He stood in the cold room with the portrait of his father watching from above the fireplace, and he thought about the 9 years he had trusted Harrow, and the 8 months he had not known about Thomas, and the 4 years Helena Marsh had walked through his house with the ease of someone who had been told, directly or implicitly, that the door was always open. Power, he had believed since he was 22, was the only honest currency. Everything else was sentiment dressed up in expensive clothes. He had built his life on that principle with the commitment of a man who had learned its truth from someone who used it as a weapon. His father had been powerful.
efficiently, brutally powerful. And that power had not saved him from dying alone in a room that no one had entered since, the correspondence of his corruption sitting bound in twine, waiting for his son to deal with.
The principle had not been wrong, but the application, the cold, sealed, self-contained application of it, the wall building and the distance and the refusal to let anyone close enough to matter, that had not been defense. That had been an invitation. Because the men who had betrayed him had not done it despite his distance. They had done it because of it. Because distance was not protection. Distance was simply a long corridor in which other people could operate without supervision. And Cedric had confused the absence of noise with the absence of threat. He came downstairs at 8 to find Eveline already at the breakfast table, dressed, reading the morning correspondence with a cup of tea at her elbow, and the methodical focus of a woman who has decided that the only available response to a difficult situation is to keep working. She looked up when he came in, read his face in the 3 seconds it took him to cross to the table. Read it the way she read everything, thoroughly and without performance. And whatever she saw there made her set the correspondence down. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. Harrow, Thomas, the missing correspondence, Edmund's timeline. He told her in the same direct, stripped-down language he used for everything, and she listened the way she always listened, entirely, with the full weight of her attention, not interrupting, not performing reaction, but actually processing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The feed supplier contract." "Harrow." The discrepancy was not accidental. "No." "How much?" "I do not yet know. Enough to retire on. Enough to be worth 9 years of loyalty to someone with deeper pockets." She picked up her tea, set it down without drinking. "Edmund paid him." "Edmund funded him." "There is a difference. Edmund never gets his hands directly on anything. He finances, he facilitates, he creates conditions, and then watches other people take the risk." Cedric sat down. The weight of the morning was in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw, in the quality of his silence. Heavier than usual, compressed differently. The difference between a man carrying a known load and a man who has just discovered the load was heavier than the scale showed. He has been building this for longer than I understood. The intelligence Thomas provided was operational, but what Harrow took from my father's room is something else. "Evidence," Eveline said. "Leverage. My father was not a careful man about what he wrote down. If the correspondence contains what I think it contains—" He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the scar on his jaw. "There are parties in Parliament who had arrangements with my father that they would prefer stayed buried. If Edmund holds documentation of those arrangements, he holds something more valuable than a bribery case against me. He holds the ability to make powerful men very, very motivated to see the Ravenshire succession resolved in his favor." The silence between them had a different quality now. Not the careful distance of 2 people learning each other, and not the warmer register they had been building incrementally across 6 days. This was the silence of shared exposure, the specific stillness of 2 people who have just realized they are standing on the same piece of ground, and the ground is not stable. "He will move soon," Eveline said. "Yes." "What does he need that he doesn't have yet?" Cedric looked at her. "Proof that this marriage is not viable, that the succession remains uncertain. He cannot challenge the dukedom directly. The entail is clear, the title is mine until I die or produce no heir. But if he can demonstrate instability, scandal, incompetence, a marriage that has already functionally failed, he can build a case for intervention with the parties whose documentation he now holds." She was very still. "He needs to destroy me." "He needs to destroy the marriage? You are the faster route." The words sat between them, bare and functional and absolutely honest. And Eveline absorbed them with the particular quality of someone who has been told exactly this. You are the point of least resistance. You are the softest target. You are the one they will come for. In different configurations by different people for her entire adult life. And had survived it, every time, by being, in the end, harder than they calculated. "Then we do not give him the instability he is looking for," she said. "That is easier said than, I am aware of that." Her voice was sharp, not angry, but sharp in the way of something that has been precise for a long time and is now under enough pressure to show its edge. "I am also aware that we are sitting here having this conversation in the open and that we do not currently know which of our remaining staff have been compromised and which have not. So the first thing we do is establish what we can trust, starting now." He looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching, without softening, with the full cold clarity of a woman who had been managing hostile environments since she was 12 years old and had never once had the luxury of falling apart. This is what he had not understood about her. What he was only now, in the 7th day of a marriage he had agreed to as a transaction, beginning to understand. She was not fragile beneath her composure. She was not waiting for rescue beneath her self-containment. She was the rescue. She was the architecture that held. Not because life had been kind to her, life had been extraordinarily unkind to her, but because every blow had added a layer of understanding that she had converted, with the relentless efficiency of someone who had no other choice, into capability. Morris, he said. Morris is certain. I agree. Who else? Cook. The 2 upstairs maids. The groom, Davis. He's been with the estate 20 years and has approximately 0 interest in anything that doesn't involve horses. He paused. That is a smaller circle than I would like. It is the circle we have. She stood, moved to the window. Her hands were behind her back. His posture, he registered distantly, borrowed or arrived at independently through the same evolutionary pressure. Edmund will make his move at a social occasion. He will need witnesses, credible ones. It will be public, documented, and designed to be irreversible. She turned back. The Hartfield Winter Ball is in 3 weeks. Yes. He will have something ready by then. He may not wait that long. He will. She was certain, and the certainty came from somewhere he recognized. The pattern, recognition of someone who had watched powerful people operate from below and had therefore seen the mechanics of it with a clarity that people inside the machine never achieved. Edmund needs an audience. He needs the tone. Whatever he has built, it is designed to collapse in public, because a private scandal can be managed and a public one cannot. He will wait for the ball. Cedric stood. They were 3 feet apart, closer than they typically stood in the course of a day, and the proximity was not uncomfortable. It had stopped being uncomfortable sometime in the last 48 hours, somewhere between the bookshelf and the dining table and the east corridor at 1 in the morning, and the fact that it had stopped was itself a fact he was now obligated to account for. He will plant something, Cedric said. He always plants. He does not accuse. He surfaces evidence that has been prepared. Forged letters, Evelyn said. Most likely. They will accuse you of... I know what they will accuse me of. Her voice was flat. She had already done this calculation. He could see it in her eyes, the way she had already run the scenario, already understood what the most damaging accusation available against a new duchess would be, already absorbed the weight of it, and converted it into preparation rather than panic. An affair, someone's name, someone credible and visible, attached to mine in documentation that looks genuine. Yes. Do you believe it will work? The question was direct, and she held his gaze while she asked it, and what she was actually asking, beneath the operational language, beneath the strategy, was whether he would believe it, whether 3 weeks from now, standing in a room full of people with forged documentation in his hands, he would look at her and choose the evidence over the person. I understood the question completely. He had been understood so rarely and so incompletely by people who claimed to know him that the experience of being understood by someone he had known for 7 days was disorienting in a way he could not file under any existing category. No, he said. She held his gaze for 2 more seconds. Then she nodded once, not with relief, not with gratitude, but with the acknowledgement of a partner confirming a variable. Then we have 3 weeks. They worked all morning. At the desk in his study, side by side for the first time, the household accounts open between them, along with the ledgers and correspondence Morris had begun assembling, and the shape of Harrow's betrayal emerged in the numbers with the horrible clarity of daylight on damage. 9 years of carefully calibrated theft, each instance small enough to be plausible as error, the cumulative total anything but. Harrow had bled the estate with surgical patience, and Edmund's money had given him the security to wait as long as it took. Eveline tracked the pattern with a pencil and made notations in a margin hand so small and precise it looked like typeset, and Cedric watched her work with the focused, dispassionate attention of a man who was recognizing, item by item, the full dimension of what he had not seen, not because he was stupid, because he had been too far inside the structure to see its exterior. The classic blindness of power, the assumption that authority equals visibility, that the view from the top includes everything below. She had no such assumption. She had come in from outside, from below, from the place where the view was unobstructed by privilege and the machinery was visible because she had always been part of the machinery rather than the person it served. At noon, a letter arrived from London. Hale's handwriting on the outside. Inside, a brief note that Cedric read once, and then read again with the stillness of a man whose blood has just dropped several degrees. He passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it, set it on the desk, picked up her pencil and put it down. The letter stated, in Hale's careful legal language, that a petition had been filed in the Court of Chancery 3 days ago. The petitioner was unnamed in the document Hale had received, but his sources indicated it was filed on behalf of a family member raising concerns about the mental fitness of the current Duke of Ravenshire to manage the estate and title, citing the rapidity of the recent marriage and several financial decisions of the past 12 months as evidence of diminished capacity. Edmund had not waited for the ball. He had moved early, before the documentation from his father's room had even been processed, which meant either he had moved the moment he learned that Harrow had been discovered, burning the bridge and accelerating the timeline, or he had always planned to move now, and the ball was never the endgame, but a secondary assault designed to land on top of a legal proceeding already in motion. Cedric stood up. He walked to the window. Outside the grounds lay frost-pale and quiet in the December light, the bare trees casting thin shadows across the drive, and the ordinary beauty of his own estate looked, from inside this window on this morning, like something belonging to someone else. He had built this. Not from nothing. The dukedom was inherited. But the man inside it, the reputation, the authority, the careful, cold architecture of a life designed to be unassailable. He had built it from the wreckage his father had left, board by board, in the years between 22 and 38, and he had believed, with the conviction of a man who had earned every inch, that it was solid. It was not solid. It had never been solid. It had been a structure with Harrow inside it siphoning the mortar for 9 years, and Edmund outside it studying the load-bearing walls, and the 17-year-old boy in the servants' wing who had been lonely enough and underpaid enough to hold a door open without understanding what he was letting in. Eveline came to stand beside him at the window. She did not touch him, did not offer comfort. She understood, with the instinct of someone who had been on the receiving end of unwanted comfort for most of her life, that comfort was not what this moment required. What it required was presence, the simple, unperformative fact of another person standing in the same storm. He's going to claim you're unfit, she said. Yes. He will use the marriage as evidence, the speed of it, my background, the suggestion that a rational man in full command of his faculties would not have made this choice. Yes. Then the marriage cannot appear to be anything other than deliberate and stable. She paused. We cannot afford the distance anymore. He turned to look at her. She was looking out the window, her profile sharp in the winter light, her jaw set at that structural angle that was not pride but load-bearing endurance. You understand what you are saying, he said. I am saying that two people who have been performing a functional arrangement need to perform something else. In public. Convincingly. She turned then, faced him. The gray eyes direct and unafraid, but underneath the directness, visible to him now because he had been watching long enough to see past the surface, something that was not entirely performance. I am also saying that it is considerably easier to perform something that is already partly true. The words landed in the room, and neither of them moved to take them back. Cedric looked at her. This woman who had been invisible for 26 years and was standing in his window telling him that the wall between them needed to come down, not because she wanted it, but because survival required it, and that she was prepared to make that choice because she was always prepared to make the hard choice, because hard choices were the only kind she had ever been offered. He thought about the crack in his chest, the one that had started in the church and widened daily, imperceptibly, the way structural shifts happen, below the threshold of dramatic event, in the accumulated weight of small recognitions. 3 weeks is not enough time, he said. It has to be. To convince an entire court of chancery and every witness Edmund has cultivated, it has to be enough, she said, and her voice was not desperate. It was simply final, the voice of someone who has run the numbers and arrived at the only remaining option, and is not interested in the grief of it right now because grief is a luxury, and they are not in a position of luxury. Because if we fail, you lose the title, and I go back to the Whitmores. The last sentence was delivered without drama, without self-pity, without any bid for his reaction, just a fact, stated with the same flat precision she used for ledger discrepancies and supplier contracts. a variable in the calculation, nothing more. Except that it was everything more, because the words, "if I fail, I go back to the Whitmores," were the most complete expression of what failure meant for her, and she had said them without breaking, and the not breaking was the thing that finally, irrevocably, destroyed the last functioning argument he had for keeping the wall intact. He did not touch her. Not yet. That was not where they were, and he was too precise a man to skip the steps between here and there. But he said, in the low register he used for things that were true, and therefore required no volume, "You will not go back to the Whitmores." She held his gaze. "You cannot promise that." "I can promise exactly that." Outside the window, the first snow of December was beginning to fall on Ravenshire's frozen grounds, pale and indifferent, and entirely without opinion about the two people standing inside the glass watching it arrive. And inside the study, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal and the shape of an assault already in motion, the Duke of Ravensshire and his Duchess looked at each other across the last remaining inches of a distance that had, by the slow accumulation of honest days, become impossible to maintain. Cedric picked up Hale's letter from the desk, folded it, put it in his pocket next to Edmund's letter, and the anonymous threat, and the weight of 9 years of misplaced trust. All of it together, all of it carried. "Then we begin tonight," he said. And what neither of them said, what existed in the space between his words and her silence, in the snow falling outside and the fire in the grate, and the 2 sets of account books still open on the desk, was that they were no longer performing a functional arrangement. They had not been for several days. The performance had, somewhere between the library and the east corridor and the window at noon on a December morning, become something that required a different name entirely. And the name was not yet speakable, but it was there. The way a wall is there even after the plaster cracks. The structure beneath, the weight-bearing truth of it, holding everything up whether anyone was ready to look at it or not. 3 weeks. Edmund had 3 weeks of legal maneuvering and manufactured scandal ahead of him. He had Harrow's intelligence and the dead Duke's correspondence and whatever names he had collected and whatever letters his forger had been commissioned to produce. And Cedric had an estate stripped of the people he had trusted, a marriage that was 7 days old, a legal challenge already in motion, and a woman beside him who had never once, in the entire duration of her acquaintance with catastrophe, chosen to break. It was, he realized, more than he had ever had before. But in 2 days, before they could begin, before the plan had drawn its first breath, Evelyn would open a second letter, this one with a name on the seal, this one from someone she knew, and what it contained would not be a threat. It would be a confession, and it would come from inside the one room in the house she had already decided to trust completely. The letter was from Morris, not delivered through the usual channel, not carried on a silver tray, not slid under a door with the quiet efficiency that defined the man's entire existence. It was left on Evelyn's vanity sometime in the early hours of the second morning after Hale's legal notice arrived, placed beneath her hairbrush with the precision of someone who knew her habits well enough to know she would find it first and find it alone. The handwriting on the outside was Morris's. She had seen it on household schedules, on inventory lists. But the fold was different, tighter, the fold of a man who had rewritten the same letter 4 times before committing to the final version. She read it standing at the vanity in the gray pre-dawn light, still in her nightgown, and the words did not rearrange themselves no matter how many times her eyes moved across them. Morris had known about Harrow for 3 years, not the full scope, not the theft, not the Edmund connection, not the correspondence. But he had known that Harrow was moving through the East Wing at irregular hours. Had known that Harrow had a relationship with a man in Edmund's London household that went beyond the occasional passing exchange of 2 servants whose employers were distantly connected. Had known, and had not told Cedric, because Harrow had come to Morris first, 2 years before Thomas, methodically working up the hierarchy, and had told him, with great care and documented specificity, that there was correspondence in the late Duke's room that would destroy the current Duke if it surfaced publicly. Correspondence that implicated not just the father's sins, but a transaction, land, money, a legal arrangement from 1839 that bore Cedric's signature, obtained at 19 under conditions that Morris described in the letter only as circumstances the young Duke was not in a position to refuse. Harrow had used the correspondence as insurance, had told Morris that any move against him would result in the documentation reaching Parliament within 24 hours. And Morris, who had served Cedric for 16 years, who was the closest thing this man had to a trusted ally, had made the calculation that protecting Cedric from exposure meant protecting Harrow from consequence, and had lived with that calculation for 3 years without breaking, until now, until Eveline. The letter's final paragraph was brief. Morris wrote that the arrival of Lady Ravenshire had changed the variable he had been managing alone. That she deserved to know before Cedric did, because the knowledge would land differently on a woman who had not yet built her entire identity around the assumption of invulnerability. That he was prepared to accept whatever consequence the Duke deemed appropriate. That he was sorry, and the word sorry in Morris's handwriting looked like it had cost him more than the rest of the letter combined. A man who had spent his life excising sentiment from his vocabulary, paying the full price for its sudden return. Eveline sat down on the edge of the bed. Sat there for exactly the length of time it took to convert shock into something operational, which was approximately 90 seconds. And then she stood up, dressed without calling the maid, and went to Cedric's room. She knocked twice. The door opened in under 4 seconds. He had not been sleeping either, or had trained himself to surface from sleep the way soldiers do, already functional before the eyes fully opened. He read the letter in the doorway. She watched his face and saw the thing she had been watching for since the East Wing, the crack, the moment when the architecture showed its fault lines. It came and went in under 3 seconds, a compression around the eyes, a stillness of the jaw that was different from his habitual control. This stillness was not chosen. It was the stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had not seen coming from a direction he had considered secured. He lowered the letter. "Get Morris." Morris came. He stood in Cedric's study with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has decided that the only dignity remaining is the dignity of full disclosure. And he told Cedric everything, every detail. 3 years of managed silence, the exact nature of Harrow's leverage, the 1839 document, the land transaction, the signature obtained from a 19-year-old who had been given a choice between signing and watching his mother lose the one property she held independent of his father's creditors. Cedric stood at the window through all of it, his back to the room, his hands behind his back, still, the posture of a man holding himself together by the deliberate application of will over the body's instinct to do something loud and irreversible. When Morris finished, the silence lasted long enough to become its own presence in the room. "You protected me," Cedric said. His voice was level, frighteningly level. "I thought I was. You gave Harrow 9 years. I gave him the years he already had. He was embedded before I knew. By the time I knew, removing him meant surfacing the document. And you made that call alone." "Yes, Your Grace." Cedric turned from the window. He looked at Morris the way a man looks at something he has built with his own hands that has just shown him a structural flaw. Not with hatred, not with betrayal's hot drama, but with the cold, clear-eyed recognition of the gap between what he believed he had and what was actually there. "You should have told me," he said. "Yes." 3 years ago, immediately. "Yes, Your Grace." "I would have found another way." Morris met his gaze. "I did not know that then. I was not certain you would." A pause, and in the pause lived the entirety of 16 years, every silence, every deferred question, every moment Morris had watched the Duke operate from behind the wall and made his own calculations about what the man inside it could bear. "I know it now." The room held the weight of that for a moment. Then Cedric said, "The 1839 document, what exactly does it show?" Morris told him. Eveline listened, and what she heard was this. At 19, Cedric had signed a transfer of a small property in Devonshire, a property his mother held separately, her own inheritance from her family, back into the main Ravenshire estate, which at the time meant into his father's direct control. The transfer had been used by his father to secure a loan from a parliamentary figure, one Lord Cavendish Perry, who was now 63, politically influential, and whose reputation rested in part on the public narrative that he had made his fortune through clean investment rather than the leveraged use of an aristocrat's coerced signature. The document was not evidence of Cedric's wrongdoing. It was evidence of his father's, but in the hands of a skilled narrative architect, and Edmund was exactly that. It could be framed as evidence of Cedric's complicity in an arrangement that would embarrass Cavendish Perry catastrophically, and embarrassing Cavendish Perry would activate exactly the kind of parliamentary reaction that could make a mental incompetence petition look very attractive to men who needed the current Duke of Ravenshire neutralized before he started asking questions about his father's debts and the people who had helped create them. Edmund did not need the document to win. He needed it to make winning unnecessary, to create enough danger in enough powerful rooms that the path of least resistance became clearing Cedric from the board before the board itself was overturned. It was, Eveline thought, a genuinely excellent play. She hated how excellent it was. The Hartfield ball is in 9 days, Cedric said. He had moved from the window to the desk and was standing behind it now, not sitting. Standing was how he thought when the problem had moved from theoretical to immediate. He will bring the forged letters there. He will also, I think, have Cavendish Perry in attendance. He will not move until he has both instruments in the room. Then we need to be in the room first, Eveline said. Both men looked at her. She was seated, which was either the least dramatic position in the room or the most, depending on whether you understood that the people who sit while others stand are the ones who have already decided. What do you mean? Morris said. I mean that Edmund's entire strategy depends on surprise, on surfacing the letters before Cedric can respond, on the public humiliation preceding the defense. If we know the night, the room, the specific accusations, we can prepare a counter before the accusation is made. She looked at Cedric. You have Thomas. A beat. He's 17 and terrified. He is also still employed here, which Edmund does not know yet, which means Edmund still believes he has a functioning intelligence channel into this house, which means Thomas can feed Edmund exactly what we want Edmund to believe about our state of preparation. Morris made a sound that was not quite a word. Cedric looked at Eveline the way he had looked at her across the breakfast table on the first morning, recalibrating, adjusting the model. But faster now. The adjustment was faster because the baseline had already moved. We feed Edmund false security, Cedric said. We feed him a version of us that confirms his assumptions, that the marriage is strained, that you are distracted by the legal petition, that I am frightened and considering returning to London. She paused. We give him a target that holds still long enough for him to commit entirely to his plan. And when he commits, when he brings everything into one room on one night, we are already there, with everything he does not know we have. We don't have enough, Morris said. The ledger evidence of Harrow's theft is circumstantial without Harrow's testimony. The petition is already filed. The Cavendish Perry document. Cavendish Perry, Cedric said. Everyone waited. He does not know that I know about the 1839 transfer. Edmund acquired that information through Harrow. As far as Edmund is aware, the document's existence is unknown to me. Cedric's voice had shifted. Lower, slower, the register of a man who has stopped reacting and started operating. Which means Cavendish Perry, if approached correctly, does not know that Edmund has it either. Edmund will have acquired it as insurance, not yet revealed its existence to the men it implicates. He will reveal it at the ball, in the room, as the final pressure point. You could approach Cavendish Perry first, Eveline said. I can approach Cavendish Perry first, Cedric agreed. Not with a threat. With the original document, which I have. My father kept copies of everything. That was his particular vanity. And with the information that Edmund Ravenshire currently holds the original and intends to use it publicly in 9 days. And with the offer that a man who assists in removing that threat from the table can expect the copy to be permanently retired. The room was quiet. That is blackmail, Morris said carefully. It is a business arrangement, Cedric said. Cavendish Perry understands those. He built his career on them. Morris looked at Eveline. Eveline looked at Cedric. And what passed between them in that look was not strategy and was not calculation. It was simpler and more dangerous than either. It was recognition. The recognition of two people who have been, separately and by entirely different routes, trained by difficulty into the same essential understanding, that the world does not accommodate the principled when the principled are under siege, and that survival is not a moral failure, it is a prerequisite for everything else. 9 days, she said. 8 now, Cedric answered. I went to London the next morning, alone. Eveline stayed at the manor, managing the household with the reduced circle of trusted staff, feeding Thomas's channel to Edmund the carefully crafted narrative of a strained house and a distracted duke. She wrote the false reports herself, in language calibrated to match what Edmund would expect from an anxious, underpaid footman, casual, slightly disorganized, laced with the kind of detail that feels authentic because it is small and unremarkable. She was, it turned out, an excellent liar when the lie was in service of something true. Cedric met with Cavendish Perry at the man's Mayfair residence on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not warned him in advance. Advance warning gave men like Cavendish Perry time to arrange lawyers and position their responses. He arrived unannounced, had his card sent up, and waited in the entrance hall with the stillness of a man who understood that the waiting itself was a message. I am not leaving. Cavendish Perry came down in 12 minutes. He was 63, heavily built, with the red face of a man whose health had been compromised by decades of rich food and rich decisions. He looked at Cedric, and in his eyes was the specific calculation of a man who has been waiting for a particular conversation for 24 years and is simultaneously relieved it is finally happening and terrified of what it costs. Your Grace. His voice was controlled. His hands were not. Sit down, Lord Cavendish Perry. They sat in a room full of expensive things, and Cedric put the document on the table between them and said nothing, because nothing was required. The document said everything. Cavendish Perry looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Cedric. Your father. My father, Cedric agreed. I was 19. I signed what I was told to sign. You leveraged what you were offered. Neither of us was a hero. But only one of us is currently at risk of having it surfaced at the Hartfield ball in 8 days by a man who will not stop at your reputation on his way to mine. A silence. The fire in Cavendish Perry's grate was the loudest thing in the room. What do you want? The older man said. I want you at the ball. I want you to know what is coming before it arrives, and I want you to be prepared to confirm, if the question is raised publicly, that you have no documentation implicating the current Duke of Ravenshire in any arrangement of any kind. Cedric held his gaze. The rest I will handle. And the copy. Retired, permanently. Cavendish Perry was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man making a decision he will never be comfortable with but cannot afford to refuse. I will be at the ball. Good. Cedric picked up the document, stood. One more thing. Edmund Ravenshire does not know about this conversation. If he asks, and he will ask because he will know something has shifted, you tell him nothing until the night itself. After that, it does not matter what you tell him. He left Cavendish Perry sitting in his expensive room with his expensive regrets and drove back through London in the grey afternoon and felt, in his chest, the combination of clarity and cost that comes from having used a tool he had sworn he would not use and having done it without hesitation, because hesitation was the luxury of men who had not yet understood what was actually on the table. The thing on the table was Eveline, her name, her position, her freedom from the Whitmores, and everything the Whitmores represented. The years of invisible labor and rationed food, and the constant erosion of a person's sense of their own worth. That was what Edmund's play would destroy if it succeeded, not just the dukedom, her, again. Cedric was not going to let that happen. The cost of preventing it, the moral flexibility required, the lines he had stepped across in Cavendish Perry's sitting room. He filed under necessary and moved on, because men who catalog their own sins too carefully in the middle of a fight always lose. And losing was not currently available as an option. He returned to Ravenshire on the 3rd day. Evelyn met him in the entrance hall. Not waiting, she was crossing from the library to the study with a folder of correspondence under her arm, and she stopped when he came in and looked at him the way she always looked at him now, the full weight of her attention landing with the precision of someone who had learned to read him fast and well. Cavendish Perry, she said. Done. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she nodded and turned back toward the study and said over her shoulder, Thomas received a reply from Edmund's household this morning. He wants confirmation that the Duke has left for London and the Duchess is alone. What did Thomas tell him? What we agreed. That you left yesterday, that I have been in my room since, and that the household is, the faintest pause, and in it the ghost of something that was not quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood, visibly diminished. Cedric almost smiled. Almost. The muscles did the thing they did, the quarter-degree shift, the near event. They worked the next 5 days with the focused intensity of two people who have stopped pretending they are working separately. The plan was layered. Cavendish Perry at the ball. Thomas as a turn channel. Morris positioned in the outer hall to intercept and delay. Hale in London filing counter-documentation against the petition. Each piece dependent on the others. Each piece capable of failure on its own. On the 6th day, a new letter arrived from Edmund. This one not to the house but to Cedric directly, at his London address, forwarded by Hale. It was the warmest letter Edmund had ever written. It expressed profound concern for the Duke's well-being. It noted that the petition had been filed by a concerned party. Edmund did not name himself, purely in the spirit of family protection. It suggested that perhaps the recent marriage had created pressures that the Duke had not anticipated, and that if he wished to discuss a more equitable arrangement for the estate management going forward, Edmund was entirely available. The letter was the tell. The unmistakable tell of a man who believes he has won and is beginning the transition from assault to administration, extending the olive branch that allows him to later say he offered resolution before the final move. Cedric read it at the breakfast table with Eveline across from him, and when he looked up, she was watching him, and what passed between them in that moment was the silent confirmation of two people who have been reading the same room from the same angle and have arrived, simultaneously, at the same conclusion. He was ready. They were ready. The night of the Hartfield ball arrived on a Friday, cold, clear, the kind of English December night that stripped the world to essentials: dark sky, bright windows, the sound of carriages on frozen gravel. The Hartfield estate was 2 miles from Ravenshire, large enough to accommodate 200 guests, traditional enough that the ton attended out of obligation as much as pleasure. The rooms would be full. The witnesses would be credible. It was perfect, from Edmund's perspective, and Cedric understood exactly why he had chosen it. They arrived at 8, together. The carriage door opened and Cedric stepped down first and turned and offered his hand, and Eveline took it and descended with the composed, unhurried grace of a woman who had decided sometime in the last 9 days that the performance and the reality had converged enough that she could stop tracking the distinction. In the entrance hall, the Ton turned to look. They always turned to look at Cedric, the height, the scar, the reputation that preceded him into every room like weather. But tonight they looked at both of them, and what they saw was not the charity match they had catalogued at the wedding, not the awkward functional arrangement they had been expecting to watch unravel. They saw a duke and his duchess enter a room together, and the together was visible in a way that could not be performed. In the proximity, in the angle of their bodies, in the specific quality of his attention toward her that anyone who had known Cedric Ravenshire for more than 6 months would recognize as something they had never seen before. Across the ballroom, Edmund stood with a glass of champagne and watched them arrive. His smile did not change. His eyes did. Cedric saw it from 40 feet away. The micro-recalculation behind the charm. The rapid assessment of a changed variable. The brief uncertainty of a man whose model has just returned an unexpected result. Edmund had been fed a picture of a strained house and a distracted duke and a frightened duchess. He was looking at something else entirely, and the gap between the intelligence and the reality was telling him, too late, that someone had been managing his information. The evening moved with the particular rhythm of a formal ball in progress. Music, movement, the steady circulation of people performing their social functions. Cedric and Eveline moved through it with the ease of two people who had spent 9 days preparing for exactly this room and could therefore afford to appear entirely unprepared. At 9:30, Edmund appeared at Eveline's elbow. Cedric was 6 feet away, in conversation with Lord Ashworth, and he did not turn. He tracked Edmund in his peripheral vision with the attention of a man who has been waiting for a specific move and recognizes it the moment it begins. Lady Ravenshire. Edmund's voice was warm. Perfect. The warmth of someone who has calculated exactly what temperature warmth should be to feel genuine. You look remarkably well. I confess I had heard some concern, family worry, you understand, that the adjustment to manor life had been difficult. Eveline looked at him. Her gray eyes were level and absolutely clear. Family concern is kind, particularly from family one has not yet met formally. I had hoped to remedy that tonight. Edmund leaned slightly closer. The move of a man creating intimacy through proximity, reducing the social distance to suggest confidentiality. I wonder, Lady Ravenshire, if you are aware of the full complexity of the situation you have entered. My cousin is a man I care deeply about, but his judgment in recent months has given the family reason for concern. There are legal proceedings underway that— I'm aware of the legal proceedings, Eveline said. Edmund paused, recalibrated. Then you understand that the petition is not a hostile act, but a protective— I understand, she said, and her voice was the temperature of February water, that the petition was filed by you anonymously 3 days after your employee was removed from my husband's household for theft and espionage.
And I understand that the documents you obtained through that employee were acquired through 9 years of corrupted access to private property. She held his gaze without blinking. The rest I expect will become clear very shortly. Edmund stared at her. For exactly 2 seconds the mask was entirely absent. Not slipped, absent. The face beneath it unguarded and cold and suddenly, visibly calculating how much she knew and from where and how long she had known it. Then Cedric turned from his conversation with Lord Ashworth and looked across the 6 feet between himself and his cousin, and said, at normal conversational volume, but with the specific acoustic quality of a voice accustomed to ending things, Edmund. The room did not stop, but the people nearest them did. The particular social phenomenon of a conversation that suddenly has weight pulling the attention of everyone in range toward it, the way a dropped object pulls the eye before the mind registers the sound. Edmund turned to face him. The charm was back, almost fully back, only slightly strained at the edges, a performance that had been prepared for this moment and was executing despite the variables. Cedric. A smile. I was just welcoming your wife. Were you? Cedric crossed the 6 feet and stood beside Eveline, and the physical fact of him there, the height, the stillness, the absolute zero of his social temperature, changed the geometry of the conversation in ways that Edmund could feel but not counter. The family is glad to see you both looking so well, Edmund said. He reached into his jacket, a move so smooth, so practiced, so carefully embedded in the casual gesture of a man adjusting his evening wear, that 3/4 of the room would not have identified it as the moment it was. I actually have something I had hoped to share with you tonight, a private matter. Perhaps we might step away from whatever you have to say, Cedric said. You can say here. Edmund's hand stopped inside the jacket. The music continued. Someone laughed on the other side of the ballroom. A waiter moved past with a tray of champagne, and Edmund looked at Cedric, really looked at him, for the first time all evening, past the performance and the strategy and the years of patient positioning, and saw something in the older man's face that he had never seen there before, and had not calculated for, and did not have a prepared response to. Not anger. Not the cold executive authority that Cedric had always projected. Something harder than that, and more dangerous than that, and infinitely more difficult to maneuver around. Certainty. The certainty of a man who is not defending something. The certainty of a man who has already won and is simply waiting for the other side to understand it. Edmund's hand came out of his jacket, empty. From across the room, Lord Cavendish Perry was watching. Cedric felt the moment when the older man understood that the moment had arrived. The slight straightening of his posture, the deliberate repositioning of his champagne glass to his left hand. Ready. Morris was in the outer hall. Hale's documentation was filed in London. Thomas had gone quiet, his channel to Edmund closed in the last 48 hours in a silence that Edmund had not yet fully processed. Every piece was in position. Edmund looked from Cedric to Eveline and back. His jaw was set. His eyes were the eyes of a man running the board in real time, assessing each remaining option with the speed of someone who understands that the window is closing and has not yet identified which door is still open. The letters, Edmund said, quietly. For the first time, quietly. There are no letters, Cedric said. The forged correspondence implicating your wife does not exist in any form that will survive the next 10 minutes. Your forger was arrested in London this morning on charges that have nothing to do with you and everything to do with the 3 other clients whose work preceded yours. Cedric's voice was absolutely level. I have been watching you build this for 8 months, Edmund. I have the ledgers, the testimony, the petition filing. I have Harrow's employment record and the financial trail between your household and his. I have Cavendish Perry in this room, who will confirm under oath that no document implicating this family exists in any politically viable form. He paused. The pause was exact. And I have my wife, who identified your strategy on day 3 of our marriage and has been managing your intelligence channel ever since. Edmund stared at him. The room around them had shifted. Not dramatically, not with the visible drama of a theatrical confrontation, but with the slow, certain redistribution of attention that happens when power moves and the people trained to track it feel the change. Heads turned. Conversations paused for breath. The tone's social radar, calibrated over generations to detect exactly this kind of seismic event, was registering something. You have nothing that holds, Edmund said. His voice was controlled. Almost. The almost was the crack in his architecture, the first audible sign of the structure giving. The petition is filed. The proceedings will be withdrawn, Cedric said, by the petitioner. You will withdraw them. You cannot compel Edmund. Cedric stepped forward. One step. The single step that closed the remaining distance and made the conversation, for everyone watching, unmistakably something other than a pleasant family exchange. You have been in my house, in my correspondence, in my accounts. You have paid my staff and corrupted my steward and hired a forger and filed a legal petition using my dead father's sins as leverage against a man who has spent 16 years rebuilding what that father destroyed. His voice had not risen. It had done the opposite, dropped, compressed, until it carried the weight of everything he was without requiring volume to deliver it. I have let you build because I needed to know the full shape of it before I dismantled it. Now I know. And you will withdraw the petition by Monday, you will remove yourself from this county by the end of the month, and you will not write to me again. The silence that followed had a specific quality, not the silence of a room holding its breath. The room was still moving, still breathing, still circulating its music and its champagne and its carefully maintained social surfaces. But the silence between these three people in this pocket of the ballroom was the silence of something ending. The particular acoustic quality of a long game concluding, not with an explosion, but with the exhausted, absolute sound of a door closing on something that will not be reopened. Edmund looked at Cedric, looked at Eveline, and in his eyes, in the cold space behind the charm that had finally, completely fallen away, was the face of a man who had played an excellent game and lost it to someone who had simply waited longer. He looked for one moment at Eveline specifically, and what lived in that look was not defeat, but something darker. The recognition that the variable he had underestimated, the woman he had dismissed as a vulnerability to exploit, had been the instrument of his undoing, that he had handed her a map of his strategy by assuming she was too insignificant to read it. He said nothing. He turned. He walked toward the edge of the ballroom with the controlled, unhurried exit of a man who will never acknowledge what just happened in this room. Because acknowledging it requires acknowledging that it was real, and reality is the last thing a man like Edmund Ravenshire is prepared to concede. Cedric watched him go. His hands were behind his back. His jaw was set. His heart, which had been running at the precise elevated rate of a man in combat for the last 9 days, was still elevated, and the elevation was no longer entirely attributable to strategy. Eveline stood beside him, close. The closeness that had been building since the East Corridor in the first week of their marriage. The distance that had narrowed increment by increment, decision by decision, through late nights and shared ledgers, and the steady accumulation of choosing each other in small and irreversible ways. She was looking at the direction Edmund had gone. Her profile was sharp in the ballroom's candlelight. Her chin was level. Her hands were at her sides, steady. "Is it over?" she said. Cedric turned to look at her. And what he felt, in his chest, where the crack had been widening for weeks, where the wall had been failing by fractions and silences, and the precise weight of a woman who had never once required him to be anything other than exactly what he was not relief. It was the thing that comes after relief. The thing that lives past the end of the fight, in the moment when the body understands that the threat is gone and has to figure out, for the first time in a very long time, what it is when it is not defending. "The legal piece is done," he said. "Edmund will withdraw. He has nothing left to deploy and no ground to deploy it from." "But," she said. She heard it in his voice, the but that had no words yet. He looked at her for a long moment. The ballroom moved around them. The music played. 200 people performed their social rituals in the candlelight, while the Duke of Ravenshire stood beside the woman he had married as a transaction and understood, with the irreversible clarity of something that cannot be unfelt, that the transaction had become something else so gradually and so completely that he could not identify the moment it happened, which meant it had not been a moment. It had been every moment, all of them. The breakfast table and the East Corridor and the 2 large ring and the ledgers and the 9 days of building something that felt, from inside it, like the most solid structure he had ever stood in. He opened his mouth, and behind him, from the direction of the outer hall, Morris appeared at the edge of the ballroom with an expression Cedric had never seen on the man's face in 16 years. Not alarmed, Morris did not do alarmed, but something underneath alarm, something that stripped every layer of the man's composure back to the unprotected face beneath. "Your Grace." His voice was low, controlled. The control of a man using every available resource to keep the words from collapsing under their own weight. A rider from the manor. Cedric turned.
It's the Duchess, Morris said. And then, before Cedric could process the word Duchess against the woman standing beside him, corrected himself with the small, devastating precision of someone who has just remembered that there are two women in this house who hold that name, and one of them is dying. The Dowager. The physician says... He stopped, looked at Cedric with 16 years of service in his eyes, and the specific helplessness of a man who has run out of ways to soften what comes next. You need to come now, Your Grace. The ballroom continued. The music played. Eveline's hand found his arm. Not taking it, not holding it, just there, present. The simple, unbearable fact of another person standing in the same moment. And Cedric looked at Morris's face and understood what the physician had said without needing to hear it. His mother was dying tonight, and the thing he had promised her, the only promise he had ever made that cost him something real, was standing beside him in a ballroom in December, with steady hands and gray eyes, and a too large ring she had long since stopped having to hold in place. He had kept it. He had kept it in ways he had not expected, and at a cost he had not calculated, and through a process that had remade him in the making. He turned to Eveline. She was already looking at him, already understanding. The intelligence in her face was not reading strategy now. It was reading him, only him, with the full undistracted attention of a person who has decided, somewhere in the last 9 days, that this is the thing worth paying attention to. Come with me, he said, not a command. The tone was entirely different from command, stripped of authority, stripped of the executive cold that he wore like armor over everything else. Just a man saying the most honest sentence he knew how to say to the only person he trusted to hear it. She held his gaze for one breath. Yes, she said. And outside the Hartfield windows, the December night was cold and absolute and entirely indifferent, and inside the carriage that carried them back through it, through the frozen dark toward Ravenshire, and whatever waited there, two people sat in a silence that had finally, completely, changed its nature. No longer the silence of distance, no longer the silence of two people managing their proximity with care, but the silence of two people who have stopped managing and started simply being, which is the most terrifying and the most essential thing that any two human beings can do. The manor lights were visible at the end of the drive. The rider waited at the gate. And Cedric Ravenshire, who had spent 38 years building a life that required nothing and no one, reached across the carriage in the dark and took his wife's hand, not to comfort her, not to be comforted, but because the wall was gone and the man on the other side of it had run out of reasons not to. The Dowager Duchess died at 11:47 in the evening, with her son's hand in hers and the sound of the December wind against the manor's east windows, and a woman she had never formally met sitting in the chair by the door, because she did not know whether to stay or go and chose, in the end, to stay. Cedric did not cry. Eveline had not expected him to. She had learned enough of his architecture to understand that grief, for this man, did not move outward. It moved inward and down, the way water finds the lowest available space, and it would settle somewhere deep and structural, and he would carry it the way he carried everything else, without display, without request for acknowledgement, with the compressed and total endurance of a man who had decided long ago that the only reliable response to pain was to keep standing in it until it became familiar enough to function alongside. He sat at the edge of his mother's bed for a long time after. His hand remained on hers even after the physician had done what physicians do, and Morris had moved quietly through the room, performing the merciful small actions that need performing. The candles burned low. The fire needed tending, and no one tended it. Eveline watched him from the chair by the door. She did not speak. She had learned, in the weeks of their marriage, that Cedric's silences were not invitations and not rejections. They were simply the medium through which he processed reality, the way some people needed to pace or talk or weep. His processing required stillness, and the most valuable thing she could offer him in this room was the presence that proved he was not alone without the demand that he perform anything in response to it. This was, she understood, its own form of intimacy, the kind that did not announce itself, after a long time. She did not track it. There was no clock in this room, only the candles measuring time in wax. He stood. He did not look at his mother's face again. He turned and looked at Eveline, and in the low light his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, not broken, not collapsed, but stripped, the way a landscape is stripped by winter. Every surface feature gone, every artificial covering removed, just the underlying terrain revealed in its actual shape. He looked old, briefly. Not in years, but in the specific aging of a man who has just lost the last person who remembered him as something other than what he became. "She wanted to meet you," he said. His voice was quiet, different from his usual register. Not lower, but less contained, the compression gone, the words arriving without armor. "I know," Evelyn said. "I told her you were not cruel." A pause. She said that was enough. It was not enough. "No," he agreed. "It was not. But it was what I knew how to say at the time." He crossed the room, not to the door, to the window. He stood with his back to the room and looked out at the dark grounds and the frost on the glass and the December sky that was beginning, at the edges of the horizon, to show the first gray hint of 4 in the morning. "She kept the east wing key," he said. "Not for any practical reason. She just kept things. Things that had been her domain. Even when she couldn't walk the corridor anymore, she kept the key on her nightstand." Evelyn looked at the nightstand. The key was there. Small, iron, ordinary. Harrow knew that, Cedric said. He knew where it was because he had been in this room, in the years when she was too ill to notice, going through her things the same way he went through the accounts, looking for anything useful. His voice was flat. Not angry, past anger, in the territory where anger has been metabolized into something colder and more permanent. "I built a life designed to be impenetrable, and the people who penetrated it did not break through the walls. They came through the spaces I left open, the places I trusted without examining." He turned from the window, looked at her. "Morris," he said. "I have been thinking about Morris." "He told me first," Evelyn said. "Not you." "Yes. He told me because he thought you would not survive the information the same way." Cedric was quiet for a moment. "And you?" "I have been surviving information for 26 years. He correctly assessed my tolerance." Something moved across Cedric's face. Not a smile, so the moment was too heavy for smiles, but the thing that preceded smiles in a man who had been relearning how to make them. A warmth, small, real, entirely without performance. "He was right," Cedric said. He moved away from the window, moved to the chair his mother had sat in on her better days, the one facing the garden, worn to the exact shape of her presence, and sat in it with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who is choosing to occupy a space rather than simply falling into it. He pressed his elbows to his knees, looked at the floor. "I have not been a man who deserved trust," he said. Evelyn did not contradict him. She waited. "I do not mean that as confession or absolution. I mean it as information. I closed everything down so long ago that I stopped understanding what closing cost. I thought distance was strength. I built the wall and called it architecture, and told myself the emptiness on the other side was freedom." He paused. The fire had gone fully cold. The room was very still. "It was not freedom. It was just a very large room where nothing could reach me and nothing could grow." She crossed the room then, sat in the chair beside his mother's bed, close enough that she was within the same small orbit of space he occupied, and she looked at him with the full weight of her attention and said nothing, because what he was doing required no commentary. It required only the evidence that someone was there to receive it. "Edmund will withdraw the petition," he said. "He has no remaining leverage and insufficient courage to pursue a losing position. He will remove himself and rearrange his life around the updated reality, and in 5 years he will have convinced himself that he had not really intended to pursue it anyway." A pause. "Men like Edmund do not understand losing because they insulate themselves from it so completely that they have always been able to reframe failure as a strategic pause. He will be fine. He will always be fine. That is the particular punishment available to people who never risk anything real." "And you," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I risked everything real and lost the person I risked it for." The words were simple, and they were not self-pity. They were the statement of a man who is looking directly at what is true and refusing to soften it, because softening it would be the kind of lie he had finished telling himself. She knew, Evelyn said, whatever else she did not live to see, she knew the petition was handled. Morris sent word before we left the ball. She knew you won. He absorbed this. She watched the absorption, the way it moved through him, the small shift in his shoulders,
the fractional release of something held very tightly for a very long time. She knew about you, he said. Morris again.
No. Before Morris. He looked at the nightstand. The key. She asked me 3 weeks ago if I had looked at her properly. Not managed her. Not assessed her. Looked at her. He paused. I told her I was working on it. Eveline felt something move in her chest. The thing that had been moving for weeks. The thing she had refused to name, because naming it meant claiming it, and claiming it meant depending on it, and depending on things had historically been the fastest available route to loss. But the feeling moved anyway, with the indifference of all true things to the preferences of the people who contained them. Your mother was perceptive, she said. She was the only honest person in my life for 30 years. His voice held something raw at the edge of it. Everyone else wanted something from me. She just wanted me to be less like my father. Are you? The question landed in the room, and he sat with it for a long time. Long enough that the sky outside the window moved from black to the particular dark blue that precedes dawn. Not light yet, but the memory of light. The color the world turns when it is preparing itself. I don't know, he said. I know I am different from what I was 30 days ago. I know that is your doing, and I know that you did it without trying. And I know that I have spent the last 3 weeks alternating between being grateful for it and being terrified of what it means that another person can do that. It means you let them, Eveline said. I did not decide to let you. No, that is how it works. She held his gaze. That is how it has always worked, for everyone. The decision comes after. You let someone in by accident or necessity or circumstance, and then at some point you have to decide whether to repair the wall or acknowledge that you are better without it. She paused. I made the same decision. I told myself I would not. I had reasons, good ones. What changed them? She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. You apologized for watching me eat, she said. On the second night, it was the first time in my adult life that a person with more power than me admitted to being wrong about something small. She looked at her hands. Small things are how you know. Anyone can manage the large moments. Small ones are the ones that tell the truth about a person. He looked at her for a long moment. The dawn was coming in slowly at the window's edge, gray and quiet, the kind of light that does not announce itself but simply arrives until suddenly the room is different from what it was. Eveline, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. Not Lady Ravenshear, not my wife, not in the formal construction he had used for the first weeks. Just her name, in his low voice. In the dark of his mother's room at 4 a.m, with the fire gone cold, and the key on the nightstand and everything between them stripped to exactly what it was. She looked at him. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I have managed estates and legal proceedings and decades of people who wanted to use or diminish me, and I have done all of it with reasonable competence. But this, he stopped. The word this covered everything. The room, the marriage, the 30 days, the hand he had reached for in the carriage, the crack in his chest that was no longer a crack, but an opening. I do not have a working model for this. Neither do I, she said. I seem composed, she said. I am composed because composure is the tool I built to survive 26 years of having nothing stable to stand on. It is not the same as being fine. It is not the same as knowing what I am doing. She paused. I am a woman who walked into a marriage she did not choose and found, instead of the transaction she had prepared for, a person she had not prepared for at all. And I have been managing the gap between those two things ever since. I was very still, listening with the full weight of his attention, the attention that had unsettled her from the first day, that saw past the surface with the penetrating clarity of someone who had trained themselves to read reality rather than performance. I'm not going to tell you that I love you, she said, because I think the word requires more time and more safety than we have yet built. And I have spent too much of my life watching people use that word as a substitute for the actions that would make it true. She held his gaze. But I will tell you that I chose you. In the East Corridor at 1 a.m, when I could have stayed in my room and let you handle it alone. At the breakfast table when I told you about the feed contract, when I could have kept it to myself and stayed safely irrelevant. At the ball tonight, when Edmund leaned close and gave me the opportunity to take his side and secure my own position regardless of how yours went. Her voice was steady and honest and stripped of every protective layer. I chose you every time, and I will keep choosing you. That is what I have. That is what I can say is true. The room was silent. The dawn light was strengthening at the window, gray becoming silver, silver becoming the first pale suggestion of a day with no weather, clear and cold and absolute. Cedric stood up. He crossed the small distance between them and stood in front of her, and she stood too, because the moment required standing, and they were close enough that she could see the precise quality of his eyes in the new light. Not cold, as she had first catalogued them, but the temperature of something very deep that had simply been still for a very long time. He lifted one hand, put it against her jaw, the way you handle something that has value, carefully, with full attention, without the performance of gentleness, but with its actual substance. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. His eyes did not leave hers. "I chose you first," he said. "In an auction house in October. 11 minutes. I didn't understand what I was doing. I told myself it was logistics. I told my mother it was practicality." A pause. The roughness of his voice was entirely unmanaged, the sound of a man who has stopped managing and is therefore hearing himself clearly for the first time. "I was lying to myself. I recognized something. In you. Something I had decided no longer existed." He paused again. "I was not wrong about that." She looked at him. The composure was still there. She was not sure it was possible to fully dismantle in a single moment what had been built over 26 years. But beneath it, visible to him because he had been watching long enough to see through it, was the unprotected face of a woman who had spent her entire life being selected for usefulness, and had just been told she had been selected for something else entirely. "What did you recognize?" she said. Someone who understood that surviving and living were different things and had not yet given up on the second one. His hand was still against her jaw. Still. Someone who was still in there. Under everything they'd done to bury her. She breathed. "In for 4, hold." But she did not finish the count, because the rhythm she had invented at 14 in a locked cellar to keep herself from falling apart was not what this moment required. What this moment required was the opposite of that rhythm. What it required was the willingness to fall and the trust that the falling would not end the way falling had always ended before. She put her hand over his, the one against her jaw, covered it with her own.